Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Committee of the Whole meeting here in November. And our first item on the agenda is our consent calendar. Is there a motion?
Motion to approve. Second.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? Hearing none. All in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. The motion carries. Next item on the agenda is appearance of visitors. We have one visitor, Ms. Catherine Shoemaker. I think Ms. Shoemaker knows the way we operate, so go ahead, Ms. Shoemaker.
Good morning, everyone. I'm here on behalf of the board and staff of Public Education Partners just to thank our outgoing Greenville County Schools trustees. We're so grateful for your service. Lisa, I know what a leadership role you have played in focusing on social emotional learning and mental health for our students, so thank you for that. Mr. Meek, thank you for your leadership of this board, especially during the bond process, building all of the new buildings here in Greenville County Schools, which is an amazing legacy. Derek, your leadership on advocacy, thank you so much for being a great partner as I've learned that and as we've worked on that here at PEP. And Mr. Suddeth, Coach, thank you for 57 years of engagement and support and leadership for Greenville County students and families as a teacher, as a coach, and now as a trustee for the last 20 years. So we are very, very grateful to all of you and appreciate your service. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we move right along to the instruction part of our meeting. Mrs. Wells.
Thank you, Mr. Meek. So item 3.01, we only have this one item. It's the state report card presentation. So Dr. Royster, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ms. Wells. Dr. McCreary is coming forward. We've prepared a report for you all on the state report card. Some of it will be a review of past information, but it's been a few years since the report card's been issued. There also were some changes in calculations in this report card that cause it to differ from past report cards. So Dr. McCreary is going to present that overview, noting in particular attention to any changes, and then provide you all an opportunity to ask any questions you might have about the report cards that were just issued to our schools. As a reminder, there is not an overall district report card grade issued anymore. The last one of those was 2019, Jason?
17.
17. Dr. McCreary.
Yes, sir. Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to be here. As Dr. Oyster said, I'll talk to you about state report cards today. There's a lot of information. Could have made this 2 or 3 hours, but for your sake and everyone else's, just keep it to 20 minutes. So I'm gonna move through it pretty quickly and then provide time for questions. So the purpose of the report cards is to provide information to citizens of South Carolina, to our principals, to administration, in order to make improvements and to show where we're excelling and where we need to improve. Report cards have been around for 2 decades, really. It changed in 2017, and so we've had this updated process based on Every Student Succeed Act, which is a federal act, and then again, report cards come from state accountability through the Education Accountability Act. So we have both federal and state statutes that require this kind of reporting. And in 2017, it was the first time those two statutes and the outcomes were truly integrated so that we have one report card that suffices for both federal and state accountability and reporting. So I do want to turn your attention to the results of COVID. We've talked about it a lot, but one of the results in 2020 report cards and 21 report cards, that reporting was waived, so we have no information from those years due to testing constraints and other restrictions via COVID. So you'll see in this presentation 2018 data, 2019 data, and 2022. So any indicator ratings, any overall ratings from 2019 were just carried forward to 2020 and 21. We also have schools, you would consider schools or programs that are not reported. Child development centers and career centers do not receive report cards. In addition, Washington Center doesn't receive a report card as a special school, and Fountain Inn is too new to receive a report card. I've talked about this, especially when we were going over high school information for the board workshop. The point rating scales for overall and all of the report card indicators lie on a 0 to 100 point index. Try to make it easily understandable. And those points you can see for elementary and middle schools come from academic achievement, student progress, and I'll talk about and refer to all these in a moment. Preparing for success, school climate, and English learners, which could also be referred to as multilingual learners, MLs, ELs, ELLs, and some may still refer to it as LEP or ESOL. For high schools, their points come from academic achievement, preparing for success, school climate, ELs, graduation rate, college and career readiness. And I will say this, for English language learners, the EL subgroup, that's a federal requirement. So according to the Every Student Succeeds Act, the EL subgroup must be and count towards a significant part of any state's accountability system. And so for South Carolina, it counts 10% or 10 points of the possible 100-point rating scale. In South Carolina, all of our schools are rated on an unsatisfactory to excellent scale. States have the freedom to choose what categories. There are some states, and we used to have an A to F rating, but in 2018, we went back to a previous categorization of unsatisfactory to excellent, where unsatisfactory being the lowest level. Average is where is the expectation for all schools to maintain or to be at that level or above. And excellent exceeds criteria. For participation rate, I bring this out because it's expected in the state that 95% of all students to participate, so you can't just have a PD day throughout testing or just send students somewhere so they can't be tested, because that will affect your overall rating. And it definitely affects the achievement indicator. So for any school that tests below 95.0% of their students, their academic achievement indicator will be reduced by 1 level. So if we have any school, for example, that achieves an average indicator for academic achievement, but yet they don't test at least 95.0% of all of their students, then they'll move that rating from average to below average. These are the subgroups. You'll see if you go to the state's report card website, you'll see subgroups reported throughout. Excuse me. But besides English language learners, none of these subgroups affect the school report card. However, my last slide and what you'll hear from us later on, we will report subgroup information because as one of the school improvement designations, ATSI and TSI, which I'll explain later, they look at subgroup performance in order to determine whether a school is in need of improvement. So that's one of the consequences for our state. There are additional changes, U.S. history from this previous year due to delays in the transition to the new version of the state standards. We tested U.S. history. It did not count for 20% of their overall rating. Districts had the discretion to use percentages from 20% to 0%. And it did not count for the preparing for success indicator at high school. Typically, preparing for success includes both biology 1 and U.S. history and Constitution. But for 2022, it did not. That also affected the points rating. In previous years, preparing for success at the high school counted 10 points. This year it counted 5 points. The remaining 5 points moved over into school climate. An additional change was to college and career readiness. The employability credential, which I'll list some information on the next slide about criteria to meet the employability credential, was added to the career readiness indicator as part of the college and career readiness. Now I just put the employability credential information there for your information as a reference, which has been discussed here before. School climates, it's changed quite a bit. We used the Cognia survey in years past. It was a poor survey. The state changed surveys. It was a measure of student engagement, although a poor measure, and thankfully they did change. Now they're using a survey. Again, we continue to survey students, teachers, and parents. Students and teacher surveys now are part of the 10 points designated for school climate. So again, we move sort of from a student engagement to a student and teacher climate survey. 80% from each of those groups must be established for participation rate, or again, it affects that rating. So this is a look at overall ratings for our schools. And you can think of these as buckets. So you see the 2018 buckets, 2019, and 2022 in each of the designated categories for schools. Our schools, as an example, we had 19 excellent in 2018, 38 excellent in 2019 and in 2022. And so as you go through there, you can see that for 2022, we had 38 schools, elementary through high school, that were excellent, or that are excellent, 24 good, 15 average, 6 below average, and 3 unsatisfactory. Now this is the overall ratings for our schools. I'm also show you here overall ratings by levels. So if you're interested in comparison from 2019 to 2022, you can see the total number of schools in each category, which is basically a table depiction of the chart that I just showed you, and then a breakdown of elementary schools, 51, 19 middle schools, and then the 14 high schools by year. Now I'm going to move from overall ratings to those individual ratings, the first being academic achievement. So achievement for elementary and middle schools is based solely on grades 3 through 8, ELA, and math scores, and its concomitant SC Alt scores. At high school, it's based solely on English 1 and Algebra 1 for this report card, and as a reminder, next year it'll be based on English 2. So this is the last year we'll see English 1. And again, the concomitant SC Alt assessments. And for the difference also between elementary, middle, and high school is that for elementary and middle schools, whoever took the test in 2022, those scores are used. However, for high schools, it's graduating cohort. So it's that group of students as a pool or as a group who are defined as a graduating cohort of 2022. That includes non-graduates and graduates. So it's that graduating cohort. The scores for them, back when they were in 8th grade or 9th grade and they took Algebra 1, also back 3-4 years ago when they took English 1, Biology 1, US History, those scores are banked, and then when they become seniors, graduates, non-graduates in that 4th year of high school, then those scores are used to establish this. So this is, in a way, a look back for our students. This is a look at, and this is information you've had previously, instead of trying to explain and visually show the points gained for both elementary, middle, and high school students. I've just made a comparison between our district and the state, and you can see those there. But in general, student scores on ELA and math for SC Ready is broken out into not meets or not meeting expectation. So you get 0 if an individual student scores at not meets. You get 1 point if they're at an approaches level. You get 2 points for meeting, and then 3 points for exceeding expectations. So it's a calculation they use for individual students to create a school's academic achievement rating. And then you can see the same for math. They do the same for ELA and mathematics. Again, Algebra 1 and English 1 for high schools uses a longitudinal cohort, so all of those scores are banked until the students become seniors, whether they're graduates or non-graduates. Schools get 1 point for every student at the D level in any of these assessments, EOC assessments. They get 2 points for a C, 3 points for B, and 4 points for an A. This is a look overall, 25 schools, and again, this is academic achievement for elementary, middle, and high school. 25 schools were rated excellent, 19 good, 29 average, 10 below average, and 4 unsatisfactory for the academic achievement indicator, which includes 3 through 8, and then a graduating cohort. Now I'm going to move from academic achievement indicator to student progress, also what's called a growth indicator. This is only applicable to elementary and middle schools, so you can think of it as a pre and post test. And in very simple terms, for every student in the school, based on ELA score and math score from the prior year, they'll take that prior year score for one student. They'll get a pool of students who have the same or very similar prior year's score. And then they look at how that pool of students do the next year and how that one student does in comparison to that pool of students. So did that student do less well? Was it on the mark average? Or did they exceed that pool of students? So they're compared in a way to very similar students based on prior achievement. And so they have a calculation where they give points based on that movement. And so this is a look at growth overall regarding both the two groups that count for growth. And so if I can explain it this way, you have all students at the school. Think of it as all students who receive growth points, which are calculated up, and that's half of the points for growth. The other half of points come from a subset of that all students, and that subset's the bottom, what's called the bottom or the lowest performing 20%. And it's not the lowest 20% across the state or across the district. Every school has its lowest 20% subgroup of all students. So it doesn't matter if 90% of students are meets and exceeds, there's a lowest 20%. So just keep that in mind. So that bottom or lowest 20% performing students count twice for this indicator. Their growth counts both for the progress lowest 20%, and they'll count again with all students. Anyway, there's calculation, creates 1 point index, basically by averaging those two marks. This is a look at student progress across the district. 15 of our schools scored excellent, 18 good, 29 average, 8 below average, and 2 unsatisfactory. Moving to preparing for success. So we've looked at academic achievement, we looked at growth or progress, and now preparing for success. Preparing for success for elementary schools, only 4th grade science counts, and it's alternative assessment. For middle schools, only 6th grade counts because it's the grades in which SC Pass is tested. And for high school, again, remember, it's Biology 1 and U.S. History, but for this year only, 22, we only use biology, and it only counts 5, not 10% of the report card. So this is a look at grades 4 and 6, Greenville County Schools compared to South Carolina, and biology, again, that longitudinal cohort of our total passing versus South Carolina. I included U.S. History, although it did not count, again, this year for accountability purposes. This is a look at, again, preparing for success for all of our elementary, middle, and high schools. 17 schools were excellent, 22 good, 29 average, 10 below average, and 8 unsatisfactory. Like I said before, with the Every Student Succeeds Act, it was a requirement for English language learners subgroup to be a significant and count towards a significant part of overall school ratings. And it counts 10% of our school's ratings, or 10 points. So these students could be in the first grade all the way through the 12th grade. That's the pool, so it's not 3rd through 8th. It's not just students who take a particular course at high school. It's those that are designated as English learners. They could have achieved proficiency, but they were not at that level when they took the access test moving into our district or coming from another district, either in the state or out of the state. They could have waivers from service, yet they were tested and they were not at a 4.4. And they could have a missing composite score. All of those students count as part of this subgroup. So the goal of these students is to reach a 4.4 composite score on access. And so if they meet 4.4, then they will get 0.4 or contribute positively towards this indicator. If they come in and we'll say they're at a 1.1 composite score, they then have you could think of it as an annual stair step and have a specific number of years in order to reach that 4.4. So everyone's going to have, it doesn't matter if you come in with a 1.1 composite or a 2.4 composite or a 3 or a 4 composite score. You'll have an individual stair step or growth expectation or annual growth goal in order to be at 4.4. Was it in 4 years? 5 years? And so you can also contribute positively to not only being a 4.4, but meeting those annual targets to get to a 4.4. So I include the percentage here. It's a little odd, but this is how the state reports it. The percentage of ELL students who met progress towards the proficiency target. You can see Greenville County Schools compared to the state there. This is a look overall at all of our schools, and for those that have the EL subgroup, we have 6 excellent, 33 good, 33 average, 2 below average, and none unsatisfactory. Moving to graduation rate, again, this is, of course, only an indicator for high schools. I included, and you've seen it before, but on the left side, graduation rates for all of our high schools. We improved from 84.1% to 84.8%. You can see our 4-year graduation rate across 5 years at the bottom right compared to the state. So we are above the state by 1 percentage point. For the graduation rate, if you think about the 22 buckets, again, we have 2 schools rated excellent for graduation rate, 7 good, 3 average, 2 below average, and none unsatisfactory. Now I'll move to college and career readiness. So we have college readiness, and you can see those indicators on the left side of the screen. For example, if any student in that high school graduating cohort scores at a 20 or above, then they are considered college ready. If they don't meet any other indicator except they have an ACT score of 20 or above, then they're considered college ready. Same thing on the career readiness side. If a student receives silver on ACT work keys, then they're considered career ready. So if a student has 20 on the ACT, a gold on work keys, then they're considered college and career ready. I say that because the state breaks down these percentages, and at the top you see college or career ready. So that means they met one of those indicators, one criteria in one of those groups, college or career. 72.7% of our graduating cohort students met college or career ready indicators. Almost 31% met college and career ready, meaning they met a criteria in both, at least one criteria in both of those groups. 34.6% were considered college ready, and 68.8% considered career ready. This is a look at again, those annual buckets of college career readiness by category. 3 of our high schools are rated excellent, 6 good, 4 average, 1 below average, and 0 unsatisfactory. School climate, again, it's discontinued from the Cognia survey. So now we're using student and teacher climate surveys, and the participation rate for students is 80%, for teachers is 80%. the quality score, the indexes and ratings lowered if you have any one of those groups scoring below 80%. So we can't compare 2019 and 2018 just because it was a completely different instrument and a totally different calculation, in addition to a new group. Before, we only included students, and now we include student and teacher responses. And so this is a look at 22 results. 10 schools were rated excellent, 21 good, 33 average, 20 below average, and 6 unsatisfactory. I will say this briefly, the rollout of this went tremendously bad. And that's a nice way of saying things. It wasn't by fault of ours. It was established that it was very untimely rollout, and that we had approximately 2 weeks to get things going whenever the state let us know. So we learned a lot of lessons. I think the state did as well with their protocol and practices. I think this will definitely improve, nothing else. I think some of the protocol and practices the state included affected some of these schools' ratings. As an example, when teachers went to take the survey within the program, and they click on a particular teacher name, they may then see employees at the school who had left the school 10 years previously. So there was a lot of names as an example. So potentially a lot of mix-up, a lot of confusion over the survey. So this is a look overall at indicator ratings for all of the categories across our district. So this includes all schools, elementary, middle, and high schools, for academic achievement. And so this is just a one place where you can see the number excellent to unsatisfactory across all of the indicators that I just showed you individually. Lastly, I want to describe briefly school improvement designations. So as part of federal and state accountability, if schools and the district doesn't meet certain expectations and certain goals for the report cards, then there are consequences. Ultimate consequence would be potentially a state takeover of a school. And again, that would be a very extreme consequence, which doesn't happen often, but it has happened. So we have federal designations, and I show these to you on the screen: CSI, ATSI, and TSI. So comprehensive support and improvement designation, schools are identified every 3 years, must be a Title I school to receive this designation, with the exception of the bottom. There's always exceptions. And again, I'm not going to go in deeply into the school improvement designations. The state has not yet released school improvement designations for 2022, where they said to expect those sometime in December. And then we're going to come back to you, I believe in January, to give you a deep overview of school improvement designations. But I wanted you to have this just to see that in general, CSI is based on Title I schools that are performing at the bottom 5th percentile of the total or overall school weightings. So they rank all schools, and those that rank all Title I schools, well, I think all schools, and then wherever that school that's performing at the bottom 5% or at the 5th percentile, then they'll take the Title I schools and see which Title I schools fall in the bottom 5th percentile across the state. ATSI is based on subgroup, all of those subgroups I showed you, so it's based on subgroup performance. What they'll do is take schools' subgroup performance, and they'll check it with the bottom 5%. So you've got that school at the bottom 5th percentile. They'll take all of these individual, and you can imagine how many, across the state, how many thousands of subgroups there are, but they'll compare all of those subgroup outcomes to the bottom 5th percentile to see which one's lower. If you have any one subgroup that's lower than that bottom 5th percentile, then your school will be designated as an ATSI school. And then you have TSI, which is subgroups performing at the bottom 10 percentile. And lastly, there are state designations. Again, the state had both leeway to create whatever designations they wanted, and it's also a requirement for Education Accountability Act. So you can see, typically they're identified each year except for priority schools. State designations include any school, so it's not just Title I, and you can see the primary criteria at the bottom there for each of these. For priority, it's a school with an overall weighted point index at or below the 10th percentile. For an underperforming school, it's any school with a below average or unsatisfactory overall rating. For an underperforming district, it's a district with 65% or more of the schools below average or unsatisfactory. And finally, chronically underperforming schools are those with an unsatisfactory rating for 3 consecutive years. I know that was a lot, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
McCrary, questions? I'm going to start with Ms. Morrison-Fair.
Thank you, Ms. Wells. Dr. McCrary, I'm interested in Woodmont and the graduation rate, and that's 96.2%.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you happen to know the track record for Woodmont for 18, 19, 20, 21, and 20? This is 22. And how consistently are they in that top?
I believe I've got it. There's just a lot of papers I have. And I've got to put my glasses on, I apologize.
I mean, that's pretty impressive to me.
All right.
Oh,
Feel like Jeff Knott.
You're looking a little like Jeff Knott.
I'll take that as a compliment.
if you want to come back to me, I can.
Sure. You got it. Thank you, Kenyatta. All right, for Woodmont High, so I'll start and go backwards. So, you know, in 22, they were at 96.2%. In 21, 93.2. In 20, 92.5. In 19, 87.9. In 18, 80.1. That's the last 5 years.
Thank you.
So they've made progress each year.
So that trend is, that's impressive to me. So what types of things are they doing to increase that graduation rate?
I'm glad you asked. I was impressed with his graduation rate as well. He takes a systems approach. I'm sure Mr. Reimer can probably better answer the question, but the things that I know he's done is put a laser focus on the EOC tested grades. He's also gotten everyone involved in making sure, so if kids aren't passing, if they're not earning credits, the 24 required credits, they're not going to graduate. So he's put a laser focus with his staff and the PLCs, the professional learning communities, where teachers meet and administrators meet, and they talk about what students' needs are, who needs, like an off-ramp to additional support. He's done a really good job of tightening all of those structures inside the school to make that vision and focus just firm and straight for everyone at the school. And everyone has a stake. Whenever I was talking with him, he says that he's gotten his coaches involved. His coaches have a responsibility that when they're meeting, and doing team skill drills and activities, before the day's over, they should be asking students, and also telling students, hey, I know you've got, you're in Algebra 1, you've got a test coming up, you make sure you do your best. And ask students, I know you're in English 1, how's it going? So it's just, he's taken it to a level that's so detailed, and that's just one example. That's very detailed, so he's not left out a lot, to where he's put the structures, the communication, the people, everything in place to make sure that they're focused on the right things.
Thank you. And one other question, would these students happen to have gone through that IB track? From, is it that Forks? or-
Some of them
Okay.
did. The graduating cohort includes all students, those that take AP, IB, CP,
Okay,
honors. It includes all students. So if they went through the IB track, they're included.
elementary. Thank you.
Sure.
Reimer, did you have anything else to add to that?
Dr. McCreary was very detailed in that response related to Woodmont. The other thing I'd mention specific to Woodmont is they're a good example of closing the gap in their subgroups, the typically underperforming subgroups. That's truly how you move the schools. Their MLs, their students with disabilities, consistently have performed higher than peer schools. And they've been very intentional about that in the remediation that Dr. McCreary was referring to. So it's definitely shared ownership at that school. And they also, I don't know that Dr. McCreary mentioned, they're also a model school, which they were recognized for their work with students with disabilities last summer, I believe, Ms. Hogan. So again, just very intentional. I think that's a good way of saying it.
I think Mr. Reimer might also add what he's done utilizing Woodmont with other high schools. Mr. Reimer?
Yes, of course, they, even before I started having Joe share with principals and assistant principals and instructional coaches, quite frankly, about half the schools had already reached out to him and have visited him. He's had principals come see him and spend time out there to try and emulate, where possible, some of the best practices that they're doing at Woodmont. So it's, I wouldn't say it's a running joke, because if you asked other principals, have you been out to see Joe, most have said that they have, most will tell you that they have, or heard him present related to it. You're welcome.
All right, so I've got Ms. Goodwin Caldwell.
That's great about Woodmont. I have a question about the designated schools support.
They do. I'm not up to date on the exact formulas. Mr. McCoy or Dr. McDavid?
We can get you, Ms. Caldwell, the specifics of each of those four categories there. We're going to cover that in our January presentation that we're doing in response to Ms. Doolin's questions. And we'll have that data, because we don't have the new funding based on, because the schools have not been designated yet, but your CSI, where's the CSI? The CSI category, that first one, that's your biggest lump of funds for schools in that category.
So, I know we don't have 2022, but y'all have been doing this for years. What is the academic support that you give to these schools? What does that entail?
So we do in Greenville.
Uh-huh.
So all of the schools that are identified in CSI are focus schools as well, which we'll review that process in January too. In addition, for CSI schools, the state also gives what they call a transformational coach that works directly with that school for the CSI schools.
Okay, so that's what they provide.
Yeah, and in several of those other ones, you'll see the ATSI and the TSI, you'll see a mix of schools that are in support of. Some of those are subgroup data, so they may need to work on their EL, subgroup of population.
So that's where your academic department, you send the people out to them.
Yes, we may send some EL instructional coaches out to work with them, but we're typically always going to have some schools in those categories just because it's focused on subgroups within a school that may be underperforming.
Okay. Dr. McCleary.
Yes, ma'am.
You had said early on that it was really the scores were based on the ELLs. It's not based on all subgroups?
Oh, just the one category. So we have, schools are rated overall. And then schools have various indicators like achievement, like preparing for success. One of those indicators that a school is rated on is a subgroup, and that subgroup is ELs. It's the only subgroup that is designated as an indicator and part of that 100 points for all schools
Is
that have
a
the subgroup.
change?
It changed
Has
in
it always
20.
been like that?
It changed.
Because I
with-
thought that all of the subgroups were weighted differently.
No. It changed with the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind. When it moved to ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act. And it was a bipartisan agreement where ELs must be a significant, contribute significantly to the points of a school and or a district. And so that only that EL subgroup was discussed and part of the ratings for schools.
No other subgroups? were?
No other subgroups, but the ATSI in particular, TSI, I don't think we get funding for it, but it is reported. ATSI, so on the backside of all of the reporting, and again, all the subgroups are reported on the state's website. You'll find subgroup information. It's not contributing, only the EL subgroup is contributing to the 100 points, 10 of the 100 points. But on the consequence side, you can't just forget about the subgroups because all of those students are counted in achievement. They're counted in, if they're part of the bottom 20%, they're counting for college career readiness. So, regardless of those subgroups, they're counting in other places. But solely for ATSI, those subgroups count for accountability consequences. So that while they're not, as a subgroup, contributing to the 100-point score in any way, except for ELs. On the backside, on the reporting side, you have to maintain high scores for subgroups, or else you're going to be designated ATSI, and consequences come with that.
Okay. That was
Yeah.
kind of confusing, but, okay. I'll probably have some more questions later. Thank you, Dr. McQuarrie.
That's it, Ms. Goonkawa? No follow-ups to get less confused? All right, Mr. Lewis.
Thanks for this information. If we could go to the college and career readiness page. Maybe back. So when I look at this, one thing I see here is the percentage of students who are college or career ready. You see a huge jump there for Greenville County schools, even proportionate to South Carolina schools. But you don't see that same jump with college and career readiness. Could we just maybe talk a little bit about the reason why maybe we didn't see those same types of gains in that second category?
Oh, okay. So for the first table, which is college or, again, college or, you either have say a 20 or higher ACT, or you have a 31 on the ASVAB. And then, so for that second table, that's designated and, so that means, for example, you'd have a 20 on ACT and a 31 on ASVAB as an example. Mr. Williams, do you have anything that you could contribute to?
Sure. I think we made an intentional effort on the career side to streamline our CTE completer pathways and make sure schools understand all the available options that are on there. I do think COVID played a little bit of a role in those college ready numbers. If you look back at the indicators here, the dual credit and the AP courses, just getting students in there, and the success rate of those was down a little bit. So, and it is cohort data, so that's the entire graduation cohort. So that group of students that graduated had 2.5 years of the COVID impact there. So we anticipate that number continuing to move in the right direction.
Mr. Reimer, do you have anything to add to just because when I also look at the percent college ready, that number drops, although the state number drops too. Is that, are we attributing that primarily to COVID, or?
Well, I certainly think it played some factor. What I was going to add to Eric, and Eric's been very instrumental in this, and Mr. McCoy as well, is we've really identified our AP students, IB, those types of students have stayed relatively, flatline is not the right word, but there's a certain cohort of students who qualify for those programs. Where we really felt like in looking at our college-ready data that we could grow still is in dual credit. And that is an area for which we put a tremendous amount of emphasis outside of, as soon as we got out of COVID, of focusing on schools just this past fall and looking at their projections of students who will receive dual credit this year. The number of courses that are being offered at almost every school has increased, which of course is going to increase the number of students. Dual credit kids, generally speaking, don't necessarily fall into any of the other areas for which they could get college ready. In other words, they're not going to take an AP class. They're not going to score that on the SAT. So I think most of our focus has been in increasing the college ready on the dual credit piece.
If you go back to this other group, if you become college and career ready, are you moving out of college or career ready, or is the same student counted in both of those?
They are. They're college or career ready indicates they're mutually exclusive groups.
Okay.
And it's only those students who would count for one or the other. But in the second table, the same students who, I think this would be the students who would count, I believe these would be mutually exclusive to the college or, because they have to have an indicator, well, they have to meet both indicators, college and career ready. So they should be mutually exclusive.
So the third group, the percent college ready, those students are counted in the top group of percent college or career ready?
They shouldn't count, because if they're counted in college and career ready, they would not count for just college ready.
Okay. So if we wanted to describe this as a trend, would it be correct to say that we're seeing more students who are career ready than 3 years ago, but fewer students who are college ready than?
Well, and I think also you hit on this as well. The students who tested ACT for the graduating cohort of 2022, they typically take ACT their 11th grade year, which would be the 2021 school year, where we started that year on a hybrid schedule, and same for SAT. So we do know that there was an effect. We also had many students at the high school level. As you know, with social distancing, we had a lot of workplaces that discontinued the work-based learning programs. We also had students move to remote or online learning. So I would agree that it is a contributing factor, especially for this cohort, the 22 cohort, because of what they experienced in 21 and in 20.
And then if we, sorry.
Excuse me just a minute, before Dr. McCreary left that point, I think, Dr. McCreary, there was also a national trend in that same period of time, fewer students choosing to prepare and go to and apply to colleges.
Typically, for the last 2 years, is 6 to 7% fewer students.
Parallel in that national trend. Excuse me.
Okay, so we define college ready by these criteria. So if a student is successful in high school but has no intention of going to college, then they may not do well on the SAT, ACT. That's what we're saying, that the trend is actually the choice the student is making about what they're doing in the future, not necessarily about whether they're prepared for college or not.
If they even choose to take it, Mr. Lewis, because as you know, even through coming out of COVID, a trend for a lot of colleges has been to suspend ACT, SAT, and not even really looking at that. So, how that will impact future students, whether or not they'll take ACT, SAT, versus, I think Jason mentioned this, like the ACT work keys, the work-based, the ACT work keys, that test is taken by every child. So there would be students who would qualify just because by nature they had to take the test in there, versus you've got kids that may not take ACT, SAT, even though they could score the 20 or the 10-20 on the SAT, ACT.
The last question is just, I know we typically don't single out schools, but if we could go to the chart on the next page. Do we know can you tell us who the 3 are that scored excellent?
3 scoring excellent is, and make sure I'm right, can you edit? Malden High School, Riverside High School, and Woodmont High School.
Okay, so the two schools that have the highest graduation rates in the district also are two of the schools that scored highest on number of students, college and career ready. And then Malden High School, which is in that listing. Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Wells. I'm going to take you back. I need you to explain this is a lot of information, and thank you. The cohort, when you're referring to, this was back at the beginning of your presentation, in specific to high school. Help me understand, explain that again. I don't even know how to ask my question because I got lost when you were explaining that.
So there's a difference when and this is the academic achievement indicator, and that's probably the best example. So for elementary and middle school students, and for the academic indicator rating, the students who took ELA and Math SC Ready in grades 3 through 8 last year established the academic indicator for elementary and middle schools. It was students who were enrolled and they took those assessments in 2022. So it's a much closer indicator. They were there in 22, they took SC Ready in 22, the 22 report card reflects their performance. In high schools, it's different. In high schools, the students who took Algebra 1 in 22, typically they're 8th or 9th graders. You won't see their scores as part of the achievement indicator for high schools reflected for 4 or 5 years from now. So it's a lagged indicator based on when they graduate. So for the 22 graduation cohort, they took Algebra 1 4 years ago in 9th grade. And so they banked the scores from 4 years ago and they use them to calculate achievement now. So typically English 1, Algebra 1, and Biology 1 are taken in the 9th grade, and then US History right around the 11th grade normally. And so those are the banking years for when they show up, their graduation year, and then reported for high schools on these indicators.
Okay, so the scores we're seeing represent 4 years ago.
4 or 5.
Okay.
If they took English 1.
For some of them.
Okay.
Depending on
The EOC.
the grade level in which you take it. So algebra would be 8th grade or 9th grade.
Right.
Biology would be.
Usually 9th.
9th, sometimes 10th.
Sometimes.
9th. US History would be 11th.
You're right.
Maybe a few 12th grade, but generally speaking, 11th.
The Algebra 1, English 1.
English 2 would be generally 11th grade, but some 10th grade.
Usually, it's usually 10th, maybe 9th.
Generally 10th graders, but could be some 9th. So when you look at that, it's the class that graduated in that year, so the 22 graduates. It's the year they took that particular test.
Okay, so it's not this past year's scores, the way we look at
Exactly.
those, the most okay.
For example, when they put up the scores back there, they would have shared with you, I believe, Jeff, this year's score.
Correct.
So it would be those students taking this year. It would be those students who took biology test last year, the students who took Algebra 1 last year, the students who took US History last year, and the students who took English 2 last year, which will vary from this. You won't see those scores until that grade level in which they took it reaches the 12th grade, as far as this report.
Okay.
Does
so
that make sense?
Well, yes and no.
Convoluted, but.
I understand what you explained. So what, if I'm let me see, if I'm understanding you, we will see the academic achievement of this year's, let's say ninth grade
Mhm.
EOC takers?
Yep.
In 4 years?
Yes,
Okay,
that's exactly correct. 10th grader in 3 years, 11th grader in 2 years, 11th grade test in 2 years.
That's,
Look at them, kind of look at it as the year they took the test, not the individual.
that's why Jason's earlier slide talked about English 1. All of these kids that are being reported in 22 all took the English 1 EOC.
okay. All right, so second question, and I think you may have kind of answered it when Ms. Goodwin-Caldwell answered, but I need to understand, I just want to make sure I understood what you said correctly about the indicators back. The ELL students are the only subgroup of, I'm just trying to understand, are there consequences if students with disabilities don't, I'm just trying to understand what you said about,
So all students,
groups.
yeah, 95% of all students must be tested. So regardless of elementary, middle, and high school, they're going to receive points or no points. So if a school says, well, we're not going to test our special education students, any students with the IEP, we're not going to test them. Well, likely that will affect their percent tested. And so if they have an excellent rating, they didn't test the special ed population, then that rating's, well, they probably wouldn't have excellent, because here's what happens. For every student that should be tested but wasn't tested, the state gives them a 0 for accountability purposes. So let's say a school has 20 special education students who qualify for N3 through 8 to be tested, but they don't test them. All 20 of those students will receive a 0. That's going to affect the achievement indicator. And in addition to that, let's say it affects it so that they get an average academic achievement indicator rating. Well, because they didn't test 95% of the students at the school, the state's going to also reduce that overall indicator to below average. So it definitely has an effect. It's not a way for anyone, for a school, or principal, or someone to skirt not testing students, because those students' scores count in college and career ready. They'll count graduation rate. They count as students in all of these indicators. It's just specifically EL students count towards their English proficiency as a subgroup standalone.
Ms. Spitz, I think what you might be referring to or remembering, Jason, if you go to the designation slide, for the report card calculations, it's the EL progress that calculates as far as the report card. On this, I think what you're maybe remembering was that we had, there is subgroups in ATSI. The state designates schools based on subgroup performance. So I think 2 years ago when we presented this, for example, there was 14 schools that were under ATSI for students with disabilities. There are any subgroup, Ms. Caldwell, to your question, can be designated as an ATSI subgroup that school has to work on. We've had subgroups for certain schools for the race white, for race black, for poverty, for limited English proficiency, and the majority of those ATSI schools identified were the students with disabilities. It's just confusing because the report card doesn't calculate students with disabilities as a specific calculation like it does with English learner progress. But it still is a calculation the state gives us to say, these schools need to work on these subgroups, and students with disability is one of those subgroups.
What's the subgroup cutoff number now, Jeff? You remember?
I'm sorry,
What's the subgroup cutoff number? Used to be,
20?
it used to be 35. It's now
20.
20. So if you got a subgroup, regardless of the size of your school, if you have a subgroup population of 20 or more, then you're going to be held accountable. One, we're going to hold you accountable internally, but from an external accountability standpoint, if you go back wherever that slide was to the 3 different statuses, where it comes into play is not there. And you had it up, there you go, in ATSI. So if you look at that center category, if a school has 20 or more students, regardless of the size of the school, in a subgroup, So subgroups could be any ethnicity, they could be ELL, they could be SPED, they could be students in poverty, which is generally speaking the one that we have the greatest challenges with as a concentration. But if you got 20 or more students, then you are judged on that basis, and it may cause you to go into ATSI, which is separate and apart from the report card grade.
Okay, I think I understand that, but let me jump to my last question. The employability credential. This began with freshman class of 2018, so when will the first graduating class be with that? Is that last year?
Last year.
Last year, okay. Do we know how many students we have that are on that?
Ms.
Ms.
Hogan.
Hogan, speak to that.
We had 52 last year, but when you say how many are on it, I don't have the number for this very second, but I could get it for you.
Yeah, 52 last year.
That graduated with it, but remember, they could get it at 18, or they could get it at 19 or 20 or 21, as we move forward. So
Right.
when you're looking at that, it's not apples to apples since they have multiple years to get it, but he's talking about in this cohort. So we had 52 last year that obtained it.
Okay. All right, thank you. I'm sure I have other questions, but I gotta weed through it all.
Without objection, I'm gonna extend for 15 minutes since I have several more speakers. Dr. Dodd.
Jason, thank you for the excellent presentation. I thought you did a great job. There was just one slide that really drew my attention, and that was slide number 34, the school climate. And as an educator myself, I understand that a positive school climate equates to student success. When the climate is positive, students succeed. And I was just a little concerned about the data, the number of students who were in the below average, the number of schools who were in the below average, and the unsatisfactory area. Also, I understood your comment that if schools did not have an 80% participation rate, they were lowered a level. And I'm wondering, is some of this data as a result of being lowered, or were any of the schools lowered a level in their school climate due to a low participation rate? Can you tell me that?
Well, let me back up a little, give just a brief background, but you can recall that report cards were supposed to be released September 1st, but then eventually they were released October 17th. They weren't released on October 13th, primarily because the school climate calculations were not complete. So they, I don't know what they did and what goes into that, but we didn't get the information, and I don't know if we still have the actual calculations that they used. So the EOC was still vetting that. So we'll get that information. We can provide it to you. I don't have it at this time, but I'll refer back to the process. The protocols that they were using and the software, which was through PowerSchool that they wanted us to use, caused just terrible experiences for us because we primarily use Backpack and we've had success using Backpack. So ETS had to work around that instead of using the PowerSchool portal. So there was a lot that schools had to overcome, not only to get the word out there about this, about the surveys, because again, the process that they used and the timing that was used, but also just with the sheer software that was used and how it was used. So I think that affected it, but we can get that participation information for you.
I would really like to see that once you receive it. And I know our district really focuses on professional development for our school administrators, and I would hope that based on this survey results that school climate would be a focus in the future. Also, I would really like to see the climate survey results for the schools in my area. I'd like to know. And also, a big shout out, I don't know who the 10 schools were that were excellent. I don't know if it's appropriate that I ask, but I would hope that they get a big shout out because I'm really proud of that. And I hope that this trend, since we can get beyond the newness of the survey instrument and how that works, I hope that this trend will really, next year when we look at this data, it's going to be much more positive on the excellent and good end.
Well, I do have the information, and I can make all of this available to you. But the schools, for 2022, the school climate excellent rating was Augusta Circle, Fountain Inn High School, Mountain View Elementary, Pelham Road, Rudolph Gordon, Sterling, Stone, Tigerville, and Washington Centers.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I would like to go back to what we were talking about just a few minutes ago, that South Carolina High School employment credential, that's the new, so that was just, has this year added to the state report card?
Yes, ma'am.
And I think it's slide, what, 9 and 10? And I am so glad to see that added. That is a long time coming, because the historical perspective from this county and this district and people that are still on this board that I remember fought very hard. That was back when Dr. Keith Ray was on the board, and we worked diligently. And I think so many times we don't, it's great to be focused on the future, but when I see things like this, it makes me stop and think, what took y'all so long? Because if you'll talk, if you know a little bit about the, you know, when we started doing that at Greenville County Schools, and you know, there was a lot of, that's just a way to, because that was back when we developed that success rate, when we had those ratings to where the, it was just horrible for schools when the report cards came out, and they had worked so hard to achieve these little tiny incremental gains, and then it was just splashed what failures they were. And Greenville County Schools, we worked to come up with that success rate, and kind of folded into that was the fact that students, those special ed students and students with disabilities, many of them attended schools up until they were 21 and never received any kind of, they didn't receive a diploma when they graduated. They didn't receive anything. And that, could you talk a little bit about the history of that, or am I just?
Well, I think you did a good job, because it did start with former board members. Both the fire and the spark and the fire came from, I think, this board to change legislation that affected students from around the state who historically, even in times of BSAP and HSAP, you know, some folks don't think of the previous HSAP as a rigorous test, but for students with some severe disabilities, test taking is a tremendous barrier. While these students still have skills and can very much contribute to society, contribute to the workplace, and be very successful. And so I think it attests to many of the board members, Ms. Hogan, and a collective team from Greenville that, again, not only was a spark, but was a fire that just led the state in making this happen.
I think it was probably the length of time that it took for this to happen.
Right.
Because I think that our community and the staff, the previous board members, the previous staff, that just kept, we had no doubt. I think it was a fire in Greenville County, because we saw how critical it was for those students to be recognized. And most of all, as a small business owner, for me to be able to look at something that those students brought to me as an employer and said, this is what I have achieved. When we received a lot of criticism about, oh, you're just doing things to try to make Greenville look better. You're just, and you know, we had no doubt it was the right thing to do. And the families of those students were very passionate about their students being recognized for how hard they worked with those disabilities to finally be recognized. I am sorry that it took so long. It was like embers, I guess, instead of a flash fire. It was like embers, because I can remember during those discussions that we said, so what if we're the only ones doing it? Hopefully this will spread, and other communities and other districts will say, let's look at what they're doing to recognize those students and prepare them for lifelong learning. And so I'm sorry that it took so long. Hopefully the state will pay better attention to what Greenville has going on as we go forward in the future. But thank you for being a part of that. And thank you for making this a little bit more palatable, because
I wish it was more
as
palatable.
we go through it, some of, you know, I think at some point in this whole presentation, everybody's eyes kind of glazed over. And I think at that point, that's when we're just very thankful that we have you to do all this and to be able to help us understand you and your
And
staff.
Miss Smith,
And
that's right.
your staff. You're very ready staff there with all
Thank you.
the things that you didn't have. She was right there with us. So we thank you very much for helping us to understand it, and for being with us through those times when people threw doubt about things. And I mean, it's on the state report card now. That is a huge, and I think that it's kind of like all of our new buildings that have been built. If you never attended school in one of those old buildings, the students and the families don't appreciate it. So I think the same way, the parents that are receiving all over the state now, not just in Greenville County, those students that are receiving these diplomas, you know, I'm sure they can't imagine a time when a student was not recognized for the accomplishments that they struggled just as hard as those top students did to achieve that success rate. So thank you very much. Finished.
Bush. So I'm going to say, you know, you did the thing that y'all always should do, which is, it was the board, but you know, I'm going to say it was Chuck Sailors that lit the fire, specifically with a group of people that he worked with at state level, because Ms. Hogan was not with us yet. She was doing some really great work in another. Yes, sir, please.
Was part of a group at the Education Policy Fellowship Program. And at the time, Mrs. Hogan was working for Horry County, who had established a program very similar to that. And I guess you could say yes to Mrs. Bush's point of view. We've been talking about this for a while, but it was my 24-year-old son, Tyler, that lit my fire, because he was a student in that regard. And on his final IEP meeting, when he was told his diploma would not get him into Greenville Tech without taking a GED, he looked at us and said, why did I get a straight A report card and it's worthless? That's a high school senior talking. All of that came into the equation. We were in class together. They break us up into these groups and they say, write a white paper. We wrote the legislation. Mrs. Mills was involved. Meredith's last name, Meredith Siebert, was an attorney that helped write it. Tommy Stringer from Greenville and Ross Turner carried it through the legislature. And I got a copy of it framed in my office at the house if you'd like to see it. So that was what got this to where we are today. But it was definitely a group effort.
I know that was a little off topic, but I think it is so important to recognize the things that happened along the way that lead to something that we just say, oh yeah, we've got one of those. And people take advantage of it. So thank you, Mr. Sailors, for providing that additional context. Ms. Without objection, I'm going to extend for 15 minutes because I have at least two more speakers. Ms. Doolan, I'm going to turn it over to you now for your questions.
I have questions about slide number 17. I'm glad that Ms. Mosley asked about the cohorts because that explains why these scores were, all these grades were received probably in 8th and 9th grade. Deductive reasoning, since there's no Fs on here, makes this look like 30% of students failed algebra and 21% failed English. Excuse me. If those students take those classes again and pass, are those scores replaced?
If they take initial credit courses again, those scores will be replaced.
So we probably haven't seen the effects of COVID and e-learning on this yet. So will you for the next 2 years remind us when we come back to this that these scores might be lower because students took these in what would have been 8th and 9th grade during the COVID years?
Yes, ma'am.
And is it typical? I sort of thought most grades were still on a somewhat of a bell curve. So is it typical, like English those grades are a little more linear, and then the algebra grades are more, not a bell curve at all, but sort of trending towards the lower grades?
I've talked about this in the past. It really depends on how the standard setting committee at the EOC chooses to set the cut scores. I've got technical manuals on each of these assessments, and what I saw with, well, it happens with SC Ready as well. And I'll just use SC Ready because it's on the top of my mind, but students' achievement, the way the cut scores were created, from 3rd grade you had a higher percentage meets and exceed, 4th grade a little bit lower, and by the time you get to 8th grade, it looks like a decline in student achievement. However, that's how the cut scores were created, to create what would look like a natural decline across grade years, but yet it wasn't. It was simply a matter of where they cut those scores. Same thing, they cut A's, B's, all the way, to not passing. A lot has to do with that initial cut score, and then it becomes that proficiency challenge where not everyone's going to have an A, especially on these assessments, because it's not like just your traditional teacher unit assessment, and the fact that these are difficult assessments. They're standardized based on the standards, and for any of these, I could use that as an example, but it is the breadth of standards, potentially any of those standards and items across the entire year. So it truly is an end-of-year course.
Jason, as I recall, I might be not exactly clear on this, but when those cut scores were established, these particular cut scores, there was a look back from predicted future college success.
That was true, and that's why we call that. I know that's true for SC Ready. That's why they say when you're at meets expectation, well, what are you meeting? Well, you're meeting college and career readiness, but particularly college. And so some of the questions I was asked, it was a bit flippant, but I was like, okay, what college? And so they don't know. They just set it at an arbitrary, well, we think this will get you college and career ready. So yes, to your point, it was a look back from a certain grade level, and then a step down of what college readiness would mean at each of those grades and across these assessments as well. So our passing across all of our grades on these standardized assessments are set at college and career ready.
So you got a system that was constructed around a theoretical level of college and career readiness success that I don't think anybody can point to research and say it's based on this set of data right here, because you're trying to project what a test you haven't given before has to predict success, and you've never given the test before. So that's the first issue. The second issue, we have a set of standards that exceed the amount of time available in a particular grade and in a particular subject to teach them. And there is no narrowing of the testing items to say, if you'll cover these areas, those will only be the areas on the test. Entirely counter to what we would expect of a teacher. We would say to a teacher, you shouldn't be given a test on something you haven't taught. So you have that issue. Then it's also good to remember that when we're looking at this, we kind of immediately think, because they use the grade A, B, C, D, this is the actual grade on that test. The teacher grade for that course is not going to look, it's probably going to look more like a bell-shaped curve, though it's not going to be probably an absolute one. But if they're doing a reasonably good job of assessment and so forth, it should be a little bit skewed to the positive, but more resemble a bell curve. Jason?
Yes, sir. And in addition, all students take these courses. So these are courses, typically they're required for graduation. As an example, I mean, you don't have to take English 1, you could skip Englishes, but in general, for EOCs, all students are taking them. If you have a learning disability, you're taking these courses. Unless you're significant, need significant modification, you might be taking SC Alt. Those scores are also counted. If you've come here from another country, you're an international student, and you're taking these courses, they may be counting depending on the sequencing of when you take it. So all students, it's not a select few students, all students are passing through these courses that contribute to these results. Sure.
Thank you. I was going to piggyback on what Ms. Bush had stated. I do remember very clearly that we were not getting credit for students that did not graduate in 4 years. If they were 5 years or more, it didn't count. But also, we wanted to reward those with disabilities. Chuck Saylor's son, I remember him telling that story at our board meeting. And not only did we work on this and make sure that it happened, but we also received a national award in Washington, and it was highly recognized across the U.S. for us implementing this program. So I commend the district, I commend our board members, and all of us making sure that this passed through the system, because today these children are working in food services and they're doing all kinds of things. So I appreciate Mr. Saylor's taking the lead on that and making sure that we put this at the forefront and it's been implemented, and now we'll just continue to build upon. I will tell you, Dr. McCrary, Mrs. Canetta Smith is unbelievable. Very impressive. She has been right there with your information every time we had a question.
I'll agree with that.
So I'm going to tell you, I would not go anywhere without her.
I don't. And I also propose that she does this presentation in the future years.
Would you like a motion to that effect? Or you must have put.
So thank you so much.
All right, are there any other board members that haven't spoken that have a question? Okay, I'm gonna ask a couple.
Okay.
One last time. So these are, did you look at these numbers as it relates to what we have in our strategic plan for how our performance, what our performance look like?
I have that information and we've got that. We sure did.
I mean, in general, is there anything that you would say we knocked out of the park here, or?
Frankly, our science scores across the district really improved greatly. Across the board, EOC biology improved, and 4th and 6th grade biology improved. So that was great. Again, a graduation rate in the face of this is still the cohort that went through COVID. So it improved, and to have not a significant decline and not sustainability, but an improvement really speaks to how well I think our teachers and principals were focused on getting on track and staying on track through COVID. So those are the two that I'd point to, and really the work and achievement across our schools and grade levels.
So I think that's an important piece of, we always say where we are with the state and what the state's report card says, but really tying that back to what's in our strategic plan and knowing that we're hitting those marks or getting closer to those marks. To circle back on the Woodmont comment about how great they've done, what they've done in 4 years has been phenomenal, and I'm so glad I've been here to see it. I know one thing that they really leveraged and used as a game changer was On Track. So that whole on-track system of having a great way to find those students and understand if it's, attendance, behavior, or their coursework grades, that, and then having a dedicated resource. So in guidance, their guidance department, and not just counselors, but their clerk and their counselors were very intentional, that detail about letting kids know where they are on the path, because all the data's there. It's just having a way to leverage it. So I'm glad that, I'm sure people are going to continue to go talk to Joe Foster about that. But I think that On Track, again, is just something that it's been a game changer, even though it was done as part of a grant process through another community-based grant partnership. On the college and career ready piece, we had that in our strategic plan as well. And I think what I understood from these numbers, if you're college or career ready, you could have been in either, could have met criteria in either one of those columns or both those columns.
You have a student who is, I believe the state looks at college only or career only, and then you have the group that achieved in both college and career.
Right. So I guess when we look at, previously for a couple of years at least, we used to give the ACT to all of our students in school. And so to Mr. McCoy's point about some kids, maybe they could pass it, but they're just not taking it because they're not just going to do that of their own accord. So I guess I wonder, could we help ourselves by going back to integrating more opportunities for the ACT and SAT in the school during the school day so that we could capture those students who could meet that mark? I think dual credit's great, so I think that's certainly a great measure, but what we said when we adopted the strategic plan is, while we think it's really important that kids may want to go straight out and get a job, and we want them to have that ability to do that. On the other hand, if they get out 2 years out and they say, well, gosh, now I want to go back and going to go to technical college or go to a 4-year college, we want to be sure that they can meet that college ready mark based on what we gave them in high school. So I guess I just wonder, has there been any discussion, maybe this is a Dr. Royster question, about how are we going to get more of our students college and career ready? Because 30% certainly is not where I would like to see our students as a whole. So
we already provide ACT, SAT during the school day. We do that already.
Don't require it.
No, we don't. Because for most students who are absolutely going to pursue a career path, there's not a reason for them to take it. What we want to make sure that we're doing on the front end is providing correct counseling following the career paths that we've established, And I think Mr. Williams has shared with you all, we've shared with you all the career trees that we have that show all the various routes you can follow because your interest is, for example, healthcare. So there's everything in there from entry-level positions that require some technical training all the way up to physicians that specialize and require years and years of med school following before you're college. So we want to make sure that based on a student's inclination, whether it's their current one or what they might want to do in the future, that we counsel them in the right direction. And if they need to take a SAT, ACT to benefit them down the road, we want them to do that. The flip side of that is if they're not motivated to do well on it, that's not in their current plan, they're probably not going to do well on it. So they're going to need to take it again when they reach the point where they're more proximate to actually going to college, if in fact colleges are still requiring ACT and SAT. And what we've seen coming out of the pandemic, that happened during the pandemic and now moving to an endemic, we're seeing that those colleges that made the decision to waive that requirement are placing that into more of a permanent status because they're acknowledging what the research already indicated, which is a greater indicator of student success in college is their actual work based on their high school transcript.
So then you're saying that the primary way you're trying to get that number up for the number of students that are college ready is based on the dual credit. I think that's what I heard Mr. Reimer, maybe Mr. Williams say.
But we believe that is a more accurate indicator of their collegiate ability. It also gives them something to go forward with where they've already earned high school credit. We believe that is a far better indicator of your college potential than a predictive score on a test. And I think that now colleges are in large numbers saying the same thing.
Well, and I don't disagree with you. I was just commenting on, back to Mr. McCoy's point about we've got kids that are probably, that we believe would be college ready by some metric that we have, but they're not.
We don't want to discourage anyone from taking ACT or SAT. We want to try to counsel people in the way that gives them the greatest flexibility to meet their future goals, perhaps some goals that they don't fully realize at this point.
Okay. So I'll ask again, the 30% college ready, the primary activities that we are engaging so that we get more students into that category are what?
The primary strategies, we would want them to be in dual credit or advanced credit courses. That would be the primary strategy because it serves a dual purpose. It not only provides and indicates college readiness, it's giving them a jump start on college, which is both a time benefit, which then translates into a financial benefit for those students. Because at least at this point, our dual credits are almost cost-free. There may be some materials cost, but all the other costs, it's cost-free. Our APs are cost-free.
5 minutes, because I know Nancy's sitting there with the timer before you complete that, without objection. Okay, I'm sorry, Dr. Rooster.
And our APs are cost-free. Yep.
So right now, the number of students, I guess we could have students that have taken one dual credit class, so they would not qualify as college ready, right? Because they need the 6 hours. So I'm just looking for where's the jump? Like, do we have, how many students? We got 30% that are college ready. Is there some number that we think we got another 20% that they've taken AP classes, they just can't get a 3? Like, I guess I'm trying to understand that 30%, do we have a long way to go just to get 5 more percentage points? Or are we really close to saying, well, we just need to change some of the courses we're offering, some of the structures in the high schools? I'm looking at those, I'm looking at.
Now,
Well, sorry. Ms.
Forgot my
Wells
name
said-
already. Oh, my God.
Sorry. I don't know why I blanked on that. I'm so sorry.
There's a plate right there.
I didn't see the plate. I'm so sorry.
He might have dozed off. I'm not sure he was awake.
I am taking a little science medication. I'm going to blame that. My coffee right here, Philip said. What I will say, as Mr. Williams and I have looked at this, we've had a significant increase in dual credit this semester. I think a lot of that is due to the fact that we have, as Dr. Royster alluded to, we've removed that, the cost barrier, because we were even seeing the cost, unlike what most people believe, the cost barrier, it was always free for students that were quote unquote met the poverty threshold. But as we looked at it from Greenville Tech side, there is a lot of barrier for quote unquote middle class families at times having to pay for that when you're also paying for sports, you're paying for everything else that you're paying for. So we've seen a significant increase, even more than we expected this semester and even going into next semester. So I do believe that you'll see a jump in that just from the dual credit standpoint. And I think Dr. Royster alluded to, we have a high success rate for the college dual credit classes. It's higher even than our AP success. Now APs are arguably, a little bit more difficult, can be certainly. But to your point, we do look at each year, and when the data comes back, we do look at that data by AP class, by school, to look at that trend data to say, do we need to retrain an AP teacher, or do we need to retrain? And balancing that line of, we don't want to discourage kids from attempting an AP class. They may sometimes do a B in the class and not pass that exam because they're not a good test taker. So we got to balance that line of, I was a terrible test taker, so that's not my strength. Now you give me a project and I'll perform great, and of course I'm just not a great test taker. We have a lot of kids like that. So we do try to balance that as far as kids may not always make that 3, but those dual credit classes, we see is a 95 or 96% success rate in those dual credit classes from our students.
Well, and I know there were some high schools that was a little bit of barrier because they were reluctant to take kids out of their AP classes and put them in dual credit because APs are offered in their school building. Right. Dual credit may not be. So if that's where we're going and pushing for that effort, then I think just making sure that there's a really robust way to get all those students on that track.
And I will say, now that's what we thought years ago, but I will say arguably that we haven't seen a decrease in AP. So our AP numbers have considered to still increase. Our dual credit numbers are still increasing. I think we're just meeting a different population of students who traditionally would say, I can't do an AP class, but they can do a dual credits course.
Well, and students that are doing both, they're doing AP and dual credit.
Correct,
right?
correct.
Yeah.
I think we now have, of course, we have more dual credit than we ever had before, but we have it more on our campuses than we've ever had before. And we've been able to get many of our teachers qualified as adjunct faculty, which simply means that now they have to meet the exact same standard that any other faculty in college transfer at Greenville Tech has to make. But it's helped us by being able to have those courses in the building, because anytime you have to leave to go somewhere, we had that same example several years ago. We moved those CATE classes from career centers to high schools, and we had like a 500% increase in enrollment. If you don't have to leave the campus, you're going to get better participation.
Well, I know that's been in the strategic plan, that was a really important part that we put in there, was to make sure we had kids college and career ready. So thank you. So with that is all we have. There was no action to be taken. Dr. McCrary, thank you. And I was going to ask you if you wanted to recognize anyone in particular that might have provided some assistance. But
I think we've recognized her.
I think,
will
yeah,
always recognize her again. Kenyatta Smith, thank you. Thank you for all you do.
Yeah. All right, thank you. With that, I'll turn it back over to the chairman, Mr. Meek.
Thank you, Ms. Wells. The item was for information. No motion is needed. Thank you, Jason, Kenyatta. Thank you, Bill. Next item on the agenda, administration, Mr. Sailors.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The topic that we've all been waiting today for with bated breath related to the comprehensive financial audit. So at this time, there's a recommended motion from the administration to accept the fiscal year 2022 annual comprehensive financial report for the year ending June 30, 2022. Is there a motion to be made?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Meek?
I'd like to make a motion to accept the fiscal year 2022 annual comprehensive financial report for the year ended June 30, 2022 as presented.
Second.
I have a motion properly made and seconded. Does the administration have any report at this time?
Yes, sir, we do. I will ask Ms. Stack if she has any opening comments, but as we believe one of the more serious, most important functions that we bring to the board annually is the review of our financial health and condition as determined by the external auditor, those individuals, that firm that is engaged to give a third-party look at the information we have reported and provide to you a report based on that third-party viewing of our financial information and applying the generally accepted principles of accounting. And one other note, they have now, like so many other things in the world, they've changed the name of this from the CAFR, which is a certified annual financial report, to the annual comprehensive financial report. That's an externally driven change. It's not something we just came up with. So, Ms. Stack?
Thank you, Dr. Royster. Yes, Ken Meadows is here to go through his report with you in PowerPoint fashion. And he is partner with Green Feeney Colley, and he was the same partner that was here last year as well. So I'm going to hand it over to Ken.
All right, thank you. First of all, before I get going, recognize Keith Campbell. He's a senior manager on the audit. He's accompanying me as well. So hopefully he can be the right-hand person. If there's any questions, he can answer those. So I'd also like to thank Robin and Therese for all their help during the audit. It's a lot of things. Their staff and the finance and accounting staff, we ask a lot of them, ask a lot of questions. I'm sure if you ask any of them, they'll say we ask for too much, but that's the nature of the audit. So anyway, I'll get going. If you look at one of the first things you get to is the opinion in the ACFR, and that kind of delineates who's responsible for what. So just as a reminder, y'all are responsible for, or the district is responsible for the financial statements and the underlying accounting systems. Y'all also are responsible for your internal controls. Our responsibility is to come in and provide an audit that the financial statements are a reasonable assurance that the financial statements are materially correct. So it's not absolute assurance, and then there's the concept of materiality. It's also not a forensic audit. It's so we're not here to detect fraud. That's not the primary purpose. The primary purpose is to render an opinion on the financial statements. And then finally, we issued an unmodified opinion. So there were no modifications necessary to the opinion. So that's the best opinion you can get. So, and that's the one that you usually get. So next, we'll take a look at some of the funds, starting out with the general fund. The general fund, you'll see the fund balance there decreased about $37 million this year, and we'll get into the reasons for that decrease in a few slides when we talk about the revenues and expenses and transfers. But it decreased down to $226 million. Of that $226 million, that can be further divided into various components. The first component would be a non-spendable component, mainly prepaid items and inventories of about $2.4 million. Then you've also committed certain dollars for special projects, various projects, and that totals to about $2.8 million. And then you've also assigned or budgeted to use the fund balance, or $13.3 million of fund balance in the fiscal year 23 budget. So that is an assignment of fund balance. And so that leaves about $208 million unassigned for fund balance. And so that's basically available for general operations. To put that into perspective, that's about 31% of actual expenditures, about 26% of budgeted expenditures for next year. And to put that into perspective, that's about the GFOA, the Governmental Financial Officers Association, recommends that unassigned fund balance be at least 16.7% at a minimum. That represents about 2 months. The board policy is a fund balance of about 8.33%. So y'all are well ahead of that. So y'all have got a healthy fund balance, I would say. Just to remind you why you want to have a healthy fund balance, you know, a large part of it is just cash flows. You collect a lot of property taxes in January, and then in June 30th, you've still got 6 more months of operations before you start receiving that property tax revenue. So at June 30th, you want to have a nice balance of cash to help you fund the remainder of the year, just because of the property tax cycle. Also, you want to have it, you know, as you would with any savings account or something like that, any significant emergencies that may arise or unanticipated expenditures. And then there are other reasons, such as your debt rating and stuff like that, that benefit you as well from having a healthy fund balance. So next we'll look at revenues. Revenues for the general fund were about $716 million this past year. You'll see most of that comes from the state, $452 million. Property taxes, you collected about $261 million in property taxes. And then you also, the federal government provide about 43, I think that should be a million there, 43 million from federal sources. That's an increase, revenues increase compared to the prior year of about $39 million. You'll see property taxes increased about $18.9 million. And that's due to increased property values. As property values rise, property taxes rise as well. But then also that fourth bullet point under that point, you'll see the TIF payments decreased this year. The local revenues decreased about $7.9 million. And that's really related to a TIF agreement that you had with the city of Greenville that expired last year. The city of Greenville had a TIF district where they were collecting property taxes, and then they would submit some money to the school district for that. That ceased last year, and those properties went back into being in the general property tax pool. So y'all basically stopped getting the TIF payment from the city of Greenville, but then y'all started collecting the property taxes as you would from a normal thing. So you probably actually received more money this year because of that, the expiration of the TIF agreement. So property taxes increased about almost $19 million. You'll see state revenues increase about $27.7 million. Compared to budget, it was about $44 million higher than budget. Revenues came in a little bit higher, mainly due to the increase in property taxes, $25 million there. And then state revenues came in higher than budgeted by about $24 million, mainly related to the PIBA payments, related to pension, and then the OPEB fund, and then also funding for teacher steps was the other big driver behind that. Looking at general fund expenditures were $679 million for the year. You'll see that's an increase of about $58 million, about 9% from the prior year. Most of that you'll see is in instruction, and then also some support. If you look behind those numbers, it basically salaries and benefits increased this past year. Those costs increased this past year. And then you also see that you added some positions this past year, driven mainly by growth, and then the new Fountain Inn High School as well. Compared to budget, general fund expenditures were under budget by about $42 million. That's mainly due to unfilled positions that were budgeted for that just weren't filled or at the beginning of the school year. And then you also had the virtual school was budgeted in the general fund, but it was actually paid with ESSER funds that were in the special revenue fund. So it kind of you budgeted it in the general fund, but you actually paid for it out of another fund. So that helps that line item come in under budget. And then finally, you had transfers in that affected the general fund. You transferred in about $32 million this year. And then you transferred out about $1.6 million this year. Almost all of that went to the capital projects fund to fund various capital projects or future capital projects. So that's basically the general fund. Looking at the special revenue funds, you had the special revenue fund. which is mainly made up of federal and state programs, local grants, and then student activity funds. Approximately 50 different types of grants and programs are covered under this fund. You'll see total revenues increased about 19% this year to about $162 million. The biggest programs under the Special Revenue Fund were the ESSER funds, which were about $62 million, almost $63 million this year. That's a slight increase from the prior year. And then the Emergency Connectivity Fund of about almost $15 million. That was a new grant this year, so that's new spending for this year. And then you also had a fund balance in student activity funds of about $15 million at the end of the school year. You'll see student activity funds as school operations return back to normal, that those funds, you'll see those revenues and expenditures increased, as did the fund balance related to it. The Education Improvement Act is another fund under the special revenue funds. You'll see that was fairly comparable to the prior year. That was about a 3.2% increase from the prior year. Other funds that you have, the Debt Service Fund had a $1.9 million fund balance, and those are kind of funds that were set aside for debt service reserves as required by bond agreements. The Capital Projects Fund had a healthy increase, or a very nice increase in fund balance this year of about $120 million, and it now stands at $228 million fund balance. And that included, like I mentioned, the transfer from the general fund of about $105 million, $106 million. Food service also had a nice increase in fund balance this year of about $11 million as operations returned back to normal. And that had a fund balance of about $30.8 million at year end. Looking at capital assets, you'll see capital assets, just kind of give you an idea of some of the capital asset activity during the year. Capital assets were about $1.2 billion, which was a slight decrease from last year. Major additions during the year were additions were about $37.5 million. Most of that was related to Robert E. Cashin, the weight room construction at several high schools, and then various furniture and equipment. Offsetting those additions were depreciation expense of about $50 million. Construction and capital outlay commitments totaled about $43 million at year end, and that included the project at Roper Mountain, and then the weight room construction was going on at several high schools. One other thing that if you look at the government, when you look at the financial statements, you'll see two big liabilities on when you get to the government-wide statements. The first one relates to the pension, and that's really your pro rata share of the state's unfunded pension, or their deficit. I guess it's partially funded. But you'll see that your share of that pension liability was about $841 million. So that's a huge liability. That's not something that the school district technically owes. It's not technically, you could argue whether it's technically a liability or not, but it does represent your participation in the state's pension plans and what they would allocate to you to be your share of their unfunded liability. So the good news is that liability decreased this past year about $9.1 million. That's the first time it's decreased that I can remember. Unfortunately, with the why the market's been the past year, these are reported usually a year behind. So unfortunately, the pension liability will go back up next year. So, or at least I would expect it to. So anyway, where you do get impacts on the school district are those rates down at the bottom. You'll see that the employer rate is about almost 20% for the SCRS, and then the PORS is about 22%. So those are the rates that you pay for every employee to participate in the retirement system. So I think next year you'll reach the limit on those, but who knows if with the pension being as bad a shape as it is, whether the legislature will continue to raise that or not. But we'll see. But next year should be the final increase in that as it stands. Looking at the OPEB, that's the other post-employment benefits, usually retiree health insurance. That plan is similar to the pension plan. It's only partially funded and there's a large deficit. So this would be your allocation of that. You'll see there the liability was $829, almost $830 million. That was an increase this past year of about $63 million. So, and you'll see that the impact on the school district there is probably just continuing to raise those rates associated with the OPEB to fund that deficit. Looking at debt this year was decreased by about $82 million just due to normal principal payments. Your outstanding debt at year end was long-term debt was $547 million. You'll see that you also had short-term debt of about $7.5 million, and that was a decrease of about $5.4 million. That kind of wraps up the financial section of the audit. From a compliance side, there were no significant deficiencies noted this year, no material weaknesses, no findings. Everything from our standpoint looked good from an internal control standpoint. We also conducted a single audit on your federal programs. You'll see we selected 3 different programs this year to test: the IDEA, ESSER, and the Emergency Connectivity Fund. So those are very large programs. No issues were really noted on that, so no findings on those as well. You've also received the management letter or the governance letter. That has required communications to the board that the AICPA believes should be communicated to the board. There's nothing that I'd really call your attention to there per se, other than you'll note that we did have a comment about the segregation of duties related to pupil activity funds. That's out at the school districts. We normally have this thing, just to remind you, that's probably the riskiest area for you at the schools, just because you have a bookkeeper out there and they do most of the stuff. Ideally, you'd have a little bit more segregation of duties. But from a cost benefit standpoint, it really doesn't make sense that you would have more people involved. So you accept that risk from a cost benefit standpoint, as all my clients do that. So, but we do put that in there just to remind you that that is a risk. And then we discussed various other matters, nothing significant enough to discuss at the board level. But we discussed that with Robin and her team as well. So just in summary, you got an unmodified opinion. The audit went well this year. I think the district's in very good financial health. And, you know, like I mentioned, the retirement health insurance, unfortunately, probably continue to rise in future years. So, but once again, thanks to Robin and her staff and Therese for all their help. And if y'all have got any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them.
Thank you very much for that presentation. First of all, Mr. Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Sailors. Just a few questions. So you guys mentioned that you did an audit of the ESSER funds?
Yes.
As part of the single audit. And were you looking at how those funds were spent, or whether they were spent in compliance with federal regulation? What did you guys look at during the audit?
That's correct. We looked to see if how they were spent was allowed under the regulations, so for the various intended purposes. ESSER 1, ESSER 2, and ESSER 3 all have various requirements associated with them on how you can spend those funds. So yes, we looked at that and they were all being spent. We didn't see any that were not being spent for permissible purposes.
Okay, and so so your finding is that those have all been spent in accordance with the current understanding of those federal regulations?
That is correct.
The other question I had is about pension liability. So if we could just talk, I know we talk to it every year, but just to make sure that it's on the record and repeated. So that number that you guys determined, the $860 million in pension liability, that is if the General Assembly stopped paying its bills and we were on the hook for what was owed to our employees? Is that how that number is
Yeah,
calculated?
actually, I mean, if they stop paying their bills, I don't think that the district would still be technically on the hook for that.
Okay.
So that's why some people would argue that this is technically not a liability of the school district, but from an accounting standpoint and the regulators, that set the pronouncements and all that, they felt that it was important to start allocating that state pension deficit back to the various employers and having them reflected on their books.
So it's a liability on paper, but there's not an expectation that a bill is going to come due for $841 million.
That is correct. That is correct. Really, the big thing is that they just start charging you more to kind of help fund that deficit and hopefully make that deficit up. But yeah, ultimately it's the rates that they charge, and ultimately I'm probably the taxpayers will have to, at some point the state's going to probably have to kick in some money, I would think.
Right.
Or do something with the benefits. I mean, there are only so many things that you can do to address the deficit.
And on page 22 of the report, you guys talked about the OPEB and the SCRS pension. Can you just describe the difference between those two?
Yeah, the SCRS and the PORS, one is the state, basically the SCRS is what most of the teachers are in. The PORS is the police officers, retired firemen. So you have some people in the district, mainly resource officers or something like that, that may have been participating in that plan, that when they come over and work for the district, they continue working underneath that plan. But that's a much smaller thing. Almost everyone's in the SCRS.
Okay. And so again, we need to be aware that liability exists, but you don't believe that we need to be saving $840 million to pay that liability today?
That is correct. Yeah, the main takeaway there is that, the rates that you get charged to participate in those plans will continue to be high, and it may be increasing. Will be increasing for fiscal year 23, but they may continue to increase beyond that.
The slide that you guys had on fund balance, we talked about different requirements for fund balance, and I can read in your report that you believe we have a healthy fund balance. There were two standards there. There was the board policy and the GFOA policy, and you're showing that our fund balance is 26% of budgeted expenditures, and they're looking at 16 and 8%. Is it your recommendation that we look at that our fund balance is currently higher than those two numbers? Does that concern you, or is it good that our fund balance is twice what GFOA recommends?
Yeah, I think if it was down at the 2-month thing, you would probably really, by the time December 31st rolls around, you might be sweating it from a cash flow perspective. That's been my experience. But each entity is different. But yeah, usually you need at least 2 months worth, that 16.7%, just from a cash flow perspective. But then you need money on top of that for unanticipated expenditures and stuff like that, and to give you a little bit more cushion. It also helps you on your debt ratings and stuff like that. So in better interest rate that you would pay as well. So you'll see this year y'all transferred out some monies to the capital projects fund. So that's a use of fund balance that you've accumulated fund balance, and then you use it so that you don't have to borrow money to fund various capital projects or improvements out at the schools and other buildings and stuff. So that I wouldn't say that I'm particularly concerned with fund balance at this level, but
okay. So and specifically for an organization like the school district, because we're going to run 6 months of bills before we collect most of our revenue, and so it's actually more than 2 months that we could go without collecting any funds from the taxpayers.
That is correct. Yes. Okay. Now, granted, state monies, very depending on the funding source from the state, those come in throughout the school year.
Okay. The last question I have is typically we ask you guys if there are any other areas that you would recommend that we maybe have an external auditor look at. As you look at our financial health, are there areas besides, I think you mentioned the local funds that are collected, student activity funds collected at the school. Are there other areas that you would recommend that this board explore with possible external auditing?
Nothing really comes to mind. I mean, everything that we've looked at, we've been pretty comfortable with. I mean, there's nothing that, any areas that I would say really concern us. We may do some unpredictable tests as part of our things, but nothing, I mean, Keith can correct me if I'm wrong, if anything comes to his mind, but nothing in my mind comes to mind that I'm like, yeah, this is a area of concern. Overall, I think that finances and accounting are appear to be well run.
Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Meek.
Thank you, Mr. Sailors. Can we go back a couple of slides to the amount of the debt, I guess?
The debt, okay.
Yeah. 547 million. What does that entail? What does that include?
That's basically, y'all got several debt issuances. Going back to the BEST program, that's the bulk of that. That's what that is.
Well, that's the amount still owed to BEST?
The amount that's still owed, yes.
And the amount, what's it, what do we pay each year on the debt?
This past year, y'all paid about $81.5 million. Next year, y'all will pay something similar to that as well.
So we're taking it down about 80 million per year, and it goes through 28, 29, 2028, 29.
Yeah, there's a debt maturity schedule in here. Let me flip to that, and I can give you the exact. Yeah, it goes out to 2031. 31, yeah.
Extended to that, okay.
So.
I believe the last best debt payment is, Robin, December
28.
28.
December 28. Okay. What was the 31 you're talking about, Kevin?
That, unfortunately, in this table, we go from 28 and 31. They're all grouped together, so I don't know exactly when they.
Okay.
But there's at least one debt that goes out to 31. So
the other
may have some other bonds.
Qualified school construction bonds that we sold.
We got a small issuance of those. Then the only other debt in there would be the annual debt
Correct.
that we incur and pay back at the end of the year.
Yeah.
That'd be the three components of that. Excuse me.
Okay.
The qualified zone academy bond is only $3.8 million right now. So yeah, it would be a very small piece that would remain.
Thank you, Mr. Meadows. That's all, Mr. Sailors.
Thank you. Ms. Wells.
Quick follow-up on what Mr. Lewis was asking, because every year we see this presentation and we have 8.33 as our board policy for fund balance, but 16.7 is what's recommended. So what do you see other districts, what do other districts have that you guys have worked with? What does their policy say on fund balance? Have they all gone to the standard, the GFOA standard, or?
Some of them may not have a fund policy, but those that do, that from my experience have been closer to they may not be 16.7%, but they're closer to it. They may be 16%. But it really depends. The larger the organization also, the more probably the flexibility you have. I mean, if you're a very small organization, you might want a much higher fund balance because it only takes one significant event to really sink you. Whereas an entity the size of the district, y'all got a lot more resources, so that it'd have to be a much larger unanticipated expense to really hurt you or hurt fund balance.
So I guess maybe I'd ask the superintendent or Robin, I mean, do you guys think that, knowing that we usually carry more than that anyway, is there any need to align policy with at least a standard that's more than 2 months versus what we have with the 1 month?
Yeah, we hadn't really talked about that recently. We've talked about it in years past. And as you know, based on your experience on the board, we're going to always recommend an amount higher than that. But by not have it set in policy, it gives you a little more flexibility. We might want to look at 10% or 12% or something, because we're not going to go below that. Our biggest concern past that minimal amount is if we were to experience any kind of mid-year cut, and we've got a little bit of a cushion beyond course, you can still use that minimum amount for that. Our biggest issue is cash flow, as you all know. I think Mr. Lewis made that point earlier, 200 some odd million in local taxes. The bulk of that doesn't come in until January. You know, we get car taxes throughout the year. State revenue, the only issue we've had with it during the economic downturn in 2010, we had payments that were delayed, which further affects our cash flow. But normally we get the 21st, Robin, on the 21st, we get our monthly payment.
21st, 22nd, sometime around there.
Somewhere around in there, we get our monthly check from the state. Our federal follows a federal fiscal year, so we're advancing money for the local portion of what we're paying salaries. We're having to advance money for federal project salaries. So we have a cash flow that we need to always meet. And then once we get which we now have with the conclusion of this audit, once you all accept it at the end of the month, we now have a number to work with that we have traditionally and will this year come back to the board sometime in the first part of the year, either prior to or simultaneous with long-range facility plan, and provide some recommended utilization of the fund balance when we have a number that we feel very comfortable with saying to you, conservatively, you could spend this money. And again, wanting to keep any fund balance expenditure, if at all possible, on non-recurring items, and to help, to the point that was made earlier, to help defer. It may not be reducing millage, but it's helping to defer a millage increase and or allowing us to move projects forward and do them more quickly than perhaps we had originally planned based on our millage flow from debt service. So we'll be bringing that recommendation sometime after the first of the year.
So if the board wanted to align their policy, our policy, with the, more the best practice or standard, you might recommend instead of going to a 16.7, going to a 10, 12%.
We might recommend a number in between there, but again, we've not, Robin, the finance staff, Mr. Davey, we haven't really had an internal discussion about that. But I seem to remember in past discussions, we've talked about around 12%.
Thank you.
Anyone else? I've got one question primarily for Dr. Royster. It's my understanding recently the state chief economist, Frank Rainwater, provided some information saying that next year's revenues for the state might be a little higher than expected, although those numbers have not been solidified.
Yes, sir.
If that happens, has anything been said, and Julie, you may be able to answer this as well, has anything been said about taking any of that new money and placing it into the retirement program to stabilize those concerns?
Other than the conversation that we had this morning about, we thought that's what they ought to do with it, but there hadn't been any, to my knowledge, they've not had any discussion at the state level about that. And that was one thing that was discussed, and a number of organizations in the state recommended that that be looked at this past year in lieu of a tax rebate to people, to put that directly in the pension system, because to the point that was made earlier, at some point, some amount of that debt in the pension system's got to be brought down. Now, whether that number on paper right there is the accurate number or not, that's questionable. But what isn't questionable is, based on the current investment patterns, there is not a sufficient amount in there to pay all the obligations without additional further contributions. And those contributions can only come from two places: the taxpayer and the participant in the system. And right now, we're right at 20%, Robin, just under 10% from those of us that are members, and just over 10% for the employer side of the contribution. Have we got those numbers right? Or we're at 20.
Yeah.
We're at 20.
20.
10 from individuals and close to 20 from us.
Correct.
So that's where that money's got to come from. So it would be, particularly the discussion last year, talking about the money available this fiscal year, was around the non-recurring increased revenue. That this would be an excellent place to put that non-recurring revenue, because obviously you're not going to get it again, put it in there to help fund the additional obligations of the pension system. And that may well be something, as we find out more about that, the board might wish to take a look at as far as a position on to advocate for utilization, especially of non-recurring additional revenue. And I'm not clear, I know that Frank Rainwater shared that with the superintendent's group last week, with the business officials this week, and I believe they're going to publicly release that and perhaps a number along with it, maybe today, Robin?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
Yeah.
They have a meeting today, so following that meeting, there'll be a public release of that information. So I'm not clear, maybe Robin knows, how much of that was recurring, how much was non-recurring, or did he specify?
I'm not sure, so I wouldn't want to say a difference.
What I heard was not specified.
I've not seen anything or heard anything that would lead me to believe he specified.
Okay, thank you. We have a motion on the floor that's been properly made and duly seconded. Any additional questions? Hearing none, all those in favor of the motion as stated, please say aye. Aye. All opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Our next item of business in order is item 4.02. This is a request coming from Mrs. Wells related to school attendance areas. Ms. Wells, if you would like to speak to the motion or speak to the information motion at this time.
Yeah, and there's a motion on there, but I think it's, maybe we have discussion and then determine, if there's, if there's a motion to put on the floor, or if we want to put the motion on the floor. So, we've had there have been a lot of different conversations, both in the boardroom and in the community lately, that have kind of centered around growth, impacts of growth, infrastructure's ability to support our growth, and those schools we're adding, and what that brings with it. In the southern end of the county, there are a number of schools, almost every elementary school Robert Cashin has been added to, and then I think every other elementary school in the next 5 years is going to be added to as well. And I have, over the years, I have consistently heard from homeowners who have contacted me and said, hey, I had no idea that I'm zoned for X school because this school is 2 miles away and the other is 12 miles away. And a lot of that has come out of zoning, attendance boundaries that were set 12, 15, 20 years ago, and then haven't been adjusted at all for the growth. So a lot of different conversations we've had. One thing I realized is one of the traditional mechanisms for how attendance zones could be changed is one that I believe there was a change in policy right before I came onto the board in 2010, where we had maybe a standing committee, and Dr. Royster might can explain this whole, the policy and the process, but we had a constituent group that would work on making recommendations for attendance zone changes, and we really haven't used that mechanism, and really haven't had any attendance zone changes other than those triggered by new schools being opened. So because several board members, we've had different conversations about it, I felt like it made sense at this time to have some conversation in the boardroom around what is the policy and how is it that the board could address attendance zones. And then really the motion is more about doing something different than is in the policy, which is why I sort of put it on as a motion. Because what I believe is that with all the growth that's happening, when you look at the comprehensive plan from Greenville County and how they've talked about the approach to growth and the need to intersect more of what they do to support public schools and where they're opening, where they're adding on, and to collaborate on that, I think it makes sense for us to have the conversation and learn a little bit more about what's going on. I did go back and look at our long-range facilities plan again, so I could understand, what our long-range facilities plan says about attendance zone changes. And there is an item in the strategies in Chapter 4 where it talks about strategies and recommendations for how to address the facilities and planning needs that we have. And the first strategy says to build space for students and programs, plan the use of temporary space to meet peak enrollment periods, consider all solutions to capital needs such as boundary or program changes. So I feel like that's one that we've really been absent from any conversation about that as a way to both can help with our growth and overcrowding potential that we have, but also to address, mobility issues. We can't get enough bus drivers, and the routes are longer in some cases because you're picking up kids and you're taking them 12 miles away instead of 3 miles away. So that was the purpose for the discussion. I didn't make a presentation. I didn't ask the administration to make a presentation, but Dr. Royster, if you could have someone talk just a little bit of history about like that policy and how attendance boundaries have been, how they've been addressed and adjusted.
I'll try. I'll try. And while I'm talking, like Mr. Webb's looking.
At the policy.
I'm in summary, because it's been a long time since that committee that you referenced, which is allowed for in policy, established in policy. I believe the last time that group was convened was in 2004 or
Bill
5.
Hartner was superintendent.
It preceded my time in the district. It was convened during the BEST program to realign attendance areas related to the new construction. And in some areas, it was a fairly extensive change of boundaries. In other areas, not as extensive a change in boundaries. As best I recall, in hearing people talk about that, the greatest impact was in areas that had the highest amount of growth, which would make sense. The other method in there is for the administration to recommend changes in attendance boundaries, and there's a process for that. Yeah, you're exactly correct. We have generally, I won't say without exception, because I'd be afraid to say that there might be some exception in there. Generally, the recommendations we have made have been aligned with we're opening a new school. We have also tried to, at least in the last 10 years, when we've opened a new school, to draw a very tight attendance boundary to facilitate additional choice from the outside. That would be true at Wittenberg, that would be true at Sterling, not so much true at Fountain Inn High School. There we tried to, and Fisher, there we tried to make certain that we got an alignment coming out of feeder pattern. Because there is great benefit, both academically and for extracurricular activities, if you can align schools in a clean feeder pattern. We unfortunately do not have much of that in the district. Part of the reason we don't have that is our building capacities do not mathematically align to provide for that. Ideally, just as an example, you'd want, say, 3 or 4 elementary schools that would feed a middle school exclusively. You went to those schools, you'd go to this middle school when you went to the 6th grade. Then you'd want that middle school and 1 or 2 others, maybe 3, to align that they all go to this one high school. To do that, you got to have capacities at each level that mathematically create the number that's required to fill the enrollment at the school they move to, whether that's a middle school or a high school. Unfortunately, probably the greatest opportunity to do that was during the BEST program, with all the construction going on. There was some of that done, I think, then, but not much. So at Fountain Inn High School, we tried to replicate that because there are great advantages to being able to do that. What we're left with is we have a pattern from over the years. Some of it, not all of it, but some of it goes back to the required desegregation plan approved by the federal courts back in 1970. But what is of even greater impact, I believe, in recent years is the fact that for good reason, we would skip over unoccupied space to put developments into a school. For example, there's a school here, and there's a bunch of fields right here, and then somebody comes in and builds a development right there, where that used to be a field as well. So when they built that, this school was closest, so we zoned those people in here, and this property, undeveloped, was either assigned to another place or stayed where it was previously assigned, which wasn't this school right here, in order to accommodate the fact we got all these people over here. Then you know what happens? Somebody comes in there and builds houses on that piece of property. Now they're going past that building over here to the Ms. Levinas Wells eyeglasses to this school. And so we're left with this quilt work, patchwork quilt of attendance areas. There's really, I guess, kind of two ways to fix that. One is you fix just a little bit at a time, using available space. Well, now the only problem with that is the available space, if you think about Greenville County, kind of long and narrow, right? It's too bad there's not a map in here, but if the map of the county was the blue poster over there, our space is up there above building a better. And our buildings that are below building a better, they're near capacity or at capacity. That'd be a fair assessment, Greg, the ones across the top of the county. Blue Ridge, Travelers Rest, and the greatest example, Greer, as far as at the high school level. Then there's some middle school and elementary seats across there as well. Greer High is probably 500 plus seats, maybe more. The others, lesser number. So there's capacity up there, but the greater concentration right now of population is south of there. Though we've begun to see people investing in building developments up in those areas. That was moving forward. The recession dropped the growth off up there, but it has now begun, although it would kind of lag behind other parts of the county, it's now begun to pick up in growth. So you could take advantage in that area of empty space. Now, other than that, it really requires you to go, the district as a whole, and rezone everything. Because if you're gonna put these people right here, in this building right here, some of the people there, if you're below the line, some of the people in that building, they gotta go somewhere else. So you're gonna disrupt one group that, hey, probably likely happy where they are, and send them somewhere where they're perhaps not gonna be as happy. You got this group here, we don't know what the level of discontent is, but we do know that we don't usually hear from them. We've had, I think in the last 10 years, 3 groups that have appealed to be placed in a different attendance area. And there is, in that policy that Mr. Webb's pulled up there, there is a caveat in there that allows for those things to be brought forward and considered. There's a timeline for doing so. But if you were gonna do that, which again is gonna create an awful lot of upheaval to a whole lot of families likely, we would recommend that if the board's considering that and the board takes a position on that, that you use a combination of the two approaches in your policy. You delegate to the administration the responsibility to draft proposals, and you get input from some citizens review committee, but further, we would not have the staff to do that in any way in a timely manner. That would need to be done by an outside consulting firm that does, you know, Greg and his staff are perfectly capable of doing it. There's not enough of them. But let them oversee that process and be done through a third party. But realizing with the capacity we have in our building, there's no way to move people in the vast majority of our buildings, to move them into that attendance area without moving a corresponding, likely equal number out to another building. And when you move them out to another building, Then there's some over in this building, they're gonna have to move out and go somewhere else. Now, there is some domino effects you can have, but it is all skewed because our greatest available seating capacity is in the top portion, the very northernmost portion of our county. Now, Mr. Webb may want to put a fine point on my kind of generic description of the policy.
I think that was good. I don't have much to add except specifically for the policy. And I was in this chair in 2010, and I remember the board revising this policy through a recommendation from the administration. But three ways to revise the attendance zones. One would be through the board of trustees, which is kind of inherent. The board would, by majority vote, recommend revision and then create a plan from there. Second is through the administration, and the policy really contemplates that is for specific schools, for a finite, limited number of schools. And then the third option is with the administration working with the Student Assignment Advisory Committee. And that's when the administration determines that there's a greater need for this committee to meet, and there are big geographic areas and schools that need to be looked at and examined and possibly tweaked. And then this committee would be formed with 15 members, and then they have a set of criteria that they have to look at. The committee would look at, make recommendations, would eventually get to the board would review and approve as necessary.
So I agree with Dr. Royster. I don't think it's something that you do. There's so much data available now. I mean, down at the parcel level and the block level from census data, that the way you would go about that would require, you could do it, but it probably should be someone outside. And I know that Berkeley County, York County, Fort Mill, Cherokee County, there are a number of other counties that are high growth or anticipate high growth that have undertaken this. I mean, when you look at the 5 schools that we're going to add onto in the southern end of the county, so was that $100 million plus investment? I didn't look up the numbers, but hundreds of millions of dollars we're going to spend over the next 10 years to either keep adding to schools or build new schools to address the growth. And it just seems like it's the right time to at least look at the information. I'm not saying that you throw everything out, but you get somebody, a consultant, to look at that information and come back and give you some really strong recommendations for, here's how we could create a center that you could reduce. Because if you look in our policy for what we say we want to do, one of them is to reduce travel time to a school so that people are staying in their communities. So because I know staff resources are limited, and I know the way we've gone about this in the past, I feel like it's the right time to take all these kind of things that we've said, that would be one way to deal with growth. That'd be one way to kind of be fiscally responsible and thinking about where should students go. And the bigger thing is, I mean, we know you look at Woodmont High School, and there's development all around it that wasn't there before. It is a great school now. So who wouldn't want to go live close to Woodmont High School? And if you could get there by sidewalk, you can't. But so getting data is power. So I think if this board is willing to say, let's look at it and be, kind of think about the future and think about our planning that we're doing, and all this money that we're spending. I think the other way that helps us is, all this conversation we've had around the infrastructure. When I read the Greenville County's comprehensive plan, one of the primary things for residents when they did all their work had to do with traffic and infrastructure. So for us to be able to say, to tell people, put people on notice in the county that, hey, we are working on this growth that's right here, and we're going to have to make our school bigger. And county, state, you be on notice that this is where we're going to have to add growth, and maybe you need to go build traffic circles now to deal with what we're going to be, expecting in the next 5 or 10 years. So it seems like we don't. I've never really had a good sense of how much distance is how much distance we are creating in terms of travel time. And again, longer bus routes, more bus routes, et cetera, because we haven't been able to, you know, to your point, Dr. Royster, we've been very, you know, kind of offhand stayed away from rezoning. And because of that, we've got distances that people are traveling that maybe are very inefficient and ineffective in terms of keeping them close to where they're getting their public education resources. So, I mean, I'd be happy to hear what any of the other board members, you know, what the thoughts are around that, or I guess what I heard you say was your recommendation would be for the board not to direct that outside consultant work, but just to delegate that authority and indicate an interest and a willingness to see that information?
I think my suggestion at this point, or recommendation to the board would be, and obviously the board as a whole will be a little bit of a different group in 2 weeks, but for that group to look at that and decide, you know, get the background. You all have the benefit of years of background, some of you back to when the last time this came up. So that they fully understand perhaps what the capacities are that we currently have, where we do have islands. In other words, some workshop to give them the kind of information they need to have. And then let them decide, is this something you want to undertake? Realizing that when you undertake to rezone people within a system, particularly where you have a general level of satisfaction, it's going to create a lot of probably dissatisfaction. So making sure everybody fully understands that. The other impact it will have, we currently have about 16% of our students choosing to go to school somewhere other than where they're zoned. Absent creating a gap in every school to allow it to be filled with seats by choice, we're going to greatly diminish choice by virtue of assigning more students. Because to get them closer to the school that's closest, to get them into the school that's closest to them, we need to, for example, if you just pick a school, one of the schools that has a high level of choice, J.L. Mann traditionally in the past has had a high level of choice, Greenville High has. If we move it to more central to the population around it, we will eliminate or greatly reduce the ability to choose to go there, unless the board decides, all right, we only want to fill it to 80% capacity. Now, probably most people in the planning business are going to say to you, Greg, 90% on initial capacity, you want to aim for like about 90%. What number?
Sir, that's right, about 90.
About 90%. So if you read, if we were presenting you with a recommendation for the whole district, we'd want to say, all right, we want to set every building at 90% capacity, but that 10% is really just room for growth. The natural growth that would occur as either you get new developments or the phenomenon that probably drives as much of our capacity issues as new developments does is the aging out and regeneration of neighborhoods. And some of you live in those neighborhoods and you've seen it in person in your neighborhood. In the neighborhood I live in, it's now into another cycle. There are a whole lot of elementary children in the neighborhood. When we first came there, it was full of retired people. But it's run a complete cycle, and there's more younger people there than before, and that's happened throughout Greenville County.
And I just, let me be sure you understand what I'm asking for consideration to do. It's not about just going out and wholesaling, rezoning everyone to get them all close to their schools. It's about knowing where we have high growth areas and knowing, you know, we're going to go put 250 seats at Fort Shoals, Ellen Woodside, Sioux Cleveland, Simpsonville Elementary, in all those schools. Well, you know what, maybe we really need 500 seats. Or maybe if you started looking at the growth and you looked at it kind of around the school versus looking at it by attendance zone. So, it's to help inform not just the next 3 years of what you're going to add or where you're going to go, but that 10-year. And I do live in a neighborhood that got rezoned from Hillcrest High School to Woodmont High School. And it's a short-term pain. People are mad about it for a minute, not a literal minute, but, a minute in time versus the long-term effects of people driving away from their community to take their kids to somewhere else to go to school. So it's it's kind of a generational impact that I think you could have if you looked at it wholesale and then didn't take the wholesale and say, we're gonna throw the whole baby out and just start over. But looking at it and saying, okay, where does it make sense? Where we're seeing, we're gonna add 220,000 people in the next, what was that time frame? The 10 years in Greenville County?
So we increased population 50%.
So looking at that and then just having that help inform how we expand our schools and those changes. Because I think, from one of the folks I talked to in Fort Mill, that if you live in that community, you don't really expect that where you're going to school now is necessarily where your kid's gonna be going to school in maybe 3 years or 5 years, because they're opening a new elementary school every year. And so we aren't seeing that growth, or a new school, not elementary school, but a new school. So it's, just to shift the mindset a little bit and say to the community, we are looking out for you and for your children and your families in considering where you go. So again, I'd be happy to just hear what the other board members' perspectives are, and kind of leave it at that.
Ms. Bush?
Yes, I just wanted to touch on one of the things that we talked about, which was.
Your microphone on, Debbie.
Yes, I just wanted to touch base on islands. I know that when we last had that committee in place, I think that last year we did away with and I know it was as we were getting ready to, but it was as we were just starting on our building program, we were able to do away with 37, 39 islands. That was a huge impact. And I don't want the fact that we, it does concern me. I realize that the trauma that wholesale, let's just dump it all out and start all over again. I would never dream of embarking on something like that, but even a mixture of being able to know where that growth is, and because that, that knowledge is powerful in where our planning takes place in a long-term aspect, but combining that with, and I think I said that years ago, is that if I see kids at a school, then if there's no growth in the northern or the west side of town, we're just forever in that limbo of still some of those islands, to where if we looked at it maybe even on a year-by-year basis, or every other year, or every 3 years, looking at those islands where the kids are going the farthest away and saying, well, maybe we can get this subdivision, and that would be that whole aspect of our planning department being able to say, well, we've really seen this community age out, and we do have room, because I know we have, and this, I'm sure this is from the desegregation orders, that we still have islands that are going from behind Cherrydale at Boulder Creek. We have students that are being bused up to Travelers Rest, up to Northwest, and we said we have the most empty seats up there, but we're still busing kids from Cherrydale past, even looking at any of the schools. There's got to be 5 middle schools that are closer, that we could look at that perspective of, well, these 2 communities have aged out, and we could kind of absorb those. And I realize, I talked to some of those parents, and they're like, my older children went to Northwest, these children, why would you take my children out of, and it would be that just for a minute pain, but when they realized, now I can go to PTA meetings, now I can go to Donuts with Dad and Muffins for Mom, because I'm not having to drive 15 miles through traffic to be able to get to something. And as a former PTA president, realizing when you say, why don't these parents from this community participate? And it's not about that they don't want to, it's logistically, they're not able to. So any of, I don't know if that committee would look at that, if the district could look at just being able to say, if we ate away, I look back now and if the last time we had that committee, if we had been able to address 2 islands a year, just 2 islands. And I know that every one of you have those islands that still exist in your, at one time before those 39 islands were taken away, I had an apartment complex that the odd numbered kids went to one school. If you lived in an odd number apartment, the even number, imagine that your next door neighbor, you're at 2 different. So we did make great strides, but then we just kind of said, okay, let's not poke the bee's nest and get anything going here. But I do think that it's crucial that we take maybe a little bit of both, and we make sure that this board, however it's comprised, looks at and weighs, and the administration can give us, maybe that's going to be a long workshop on what could be done as far as addressing immediate concerns, as well as what Ms. Wells has said as long-term concerns.
I think that's a good point, Ms. Bush, and reinforce the idea that people coming on board need to have the background they need to have. There are people that are on this board that have been through this process before. There are other people that are currently on the board and will continue to be on the board that have never been in that process. I think we have 200 and some odd islands. Greg, how many islands do we have now?
We have about 201 geocodes, but how we classify islands is 101.
101 islands. Now, the thing that has shifted in that period of time, you alluded to that, there is no room in elementary schools on the west side. In fact, Cherrydale, you mentioned that as a specific example, it's full. There's some middle school seats on the west side of Greenville, but I believe just about all the elementaries are at capacity. We've got a planned addition at Tanglewood Middle School to meet growth there. That's just growth from the currently zoned population there. There is some amount of space at Lakeview and Berea Middle School. I don't remember offhand how much. I do not believe there's appreciable space at any elementary. The other issue is, as neighborhoods age out, the thing that we see that happens is then they begin a cycle that starts over. So you could, because we've seen that in multiple neighborhoods in the, gosh, I've been here now like 17 years. We've seen them go through, they had older families there, then they had younger families, then they went to middle school, then they went to high school, then they aged out, then they started over. There's a generational cycle there. So if you don't leave a cushion for that, then you're back in the same thing as they cycle up through the system. As you indicated in what you said, it is a very complex and complicated matter. And the other thing we always try to do is bring to you all facility recommendations that are just ahead of time. Because if we do anything other than that, we place you in the position of recommending to you a tax increase to build way in advance of the need. Now, we don't want to have 150 portables in use either. And I think right now we got 29 in use, something like that, Greg? 20 some odd? So that, I mean, that's reasonable. You're going to have to use them from time to time. In fact, there's 2, or there's a double and a single, I believe, at Cherrydale in use now.
We call those learning cottages.
Yeah, they're nice. They don't look like the ones looked before the BEST program. So at least they are nice facilities. They're comparable to being inside, just not quite as nice as being inside the building. But it's a very complicated issue.
We have 2 more that have requested time to speak, and we're out of time. So I'm going to extend without objection for 15. Ms. Goodwin-Caldwell?
Okay, yes, this is something that needs to be addressed, and I know it's complex and complicated, but if we don't address it now, if not now, then when? And you was speaking about Cherrydale. Whenever they built Cherrydale, we had the Cone property, we had the San Souci property. Cone had a whole lot of property, but we chose to build on San Souci, which is landlocked. And when we built it, we didn't build it big enough. That's why we don't have capacity for it. Just like some of these other schools, I have people on the islands, out here on the island by themselves, that the kids from Highlands pass maybe 5, 6 schools to go all the way down to Sioux Cleveland. The ones in Piedmont Manor go all the way down to Malden Elementary, middle, and high school. And I know that is, we've got to look at that. And when Doug said the 3 things that we can do, we need to do at least one of them to address it. It's something that it needs to be addressed. And I know that we have a lot of islands that were created from growth, but when they did the BEST program, and y'all got rid of a lot of islands, what happened to those that were left? They're still here. And like she said, under the desegregation plan. So it is something that needs to be addressed, and yeah, it might piss a lot of people off if their kids are moved to another school. But you know, I didn't mean to use that word, but it will. But we do need to address this. We need to address it, and we can't just keep putting it off. Because I feel like it's going to be a bigger problem in the future, and looking and moving forward, like looking at Fountain Inn High School. We already have a plan to add to Fountain Inn. Why we didn't do it when we built it? I'm trying to understand it, and this has always been a frustration with me about, and Burke knows that it's been a frustration, and he has explained about all of the dynamics of it, but we've got to do something because Greenville is growing, and when you have kids that you are busing 12 miles away, because I have parents that come to me and say, my child missed the bus. I can't get them to school. So they miss school that day because they don't have the transportation to take them all the way down to Malden. So we do need to address this. I feel that this is something that needs to be addressed.
I do want to speak to one thing that you said, Ms. Caldwell. The reason that we didn't put those seats at Fountain Inn, that would have simply required us to come to the board and ask for a millage increase. We didn't need the seats at the time. We've got it in the long-range facility plan now. We have it in there at the point where the population will warrant it, and it won't require a millage increase to construct it.
But with the way that we are putting students into Fountain Inn, won't it be after the amount that is at capacity that we will have the rest of the addition built? I mean,
No, ma'am.
So we'll have enough room at Fountain Inn.
We'll have enough room based on our current
when it
population
comes to
projections, yeah.
capacity. Well, I was under the impression that, I mean, as soon as we built it, we were asking for an addition. So,
Yeah, we did. We put it in the design. We did the site work to accommodate the construction of it. And we have a drawing already in place for the facility. It's basically
we do
a
need to,
mirror image of the academic wing that we currently have.
well, it does need to be addressed.
That it?
That's all I have.
Thank you, Derek.
Thank you, Mr. Sailors. Thank you, Ms. Wells, for requesting this. So if you could just clarify for me, so I heard the mechanisms for getting an area changed from one attendance area to another. So not a special permission for a parent to change, but actually to say we want this neighborhood to be changed to be a Greenville high attendance area instead of a jail man attendance area? What are the mechanisms that exist in board policy? Because I want to make sure that we're clear on that.
So back in 2010, the discussion centered sort of on the micro, small attendance zone, 1 or 2 schools. That would really fall within the administration's bringing a plan to the board to be approved for that change. Then you also have sort of your global and the macro as well, and it could be micro, just a board on its own requesting the change. It could be for a small, finite, or something larger. And then that third option is when the administration believes and requests that the student assignment advisory committee should meet, because there's a need for a vast amount of several changes that need to be made throughout the school district. So really that was a discussion back in 2010 that kind of resulted in the revisions to the policy. And so you have just 1 or 2, usually falls within the administration to bring to the board. If you have something larger, it's either the board or the advisory committee that would be implemented.
Okay, but the advisory committee doesn't exist.
It does not.
Even though board policy establishes it and board policy directs that each board member appoints someone to the committee, there is no committee to appoint someone to.
So the committee is formed and really is initiated upon request by the administration. And then there's a process that would go in effect from there. The board could also request it as well.
So how does it, because this came up during other conversations, how does a constituent say, I would like my neighborhood to be changed? Because they can't appeal it to a committee that doesn't exist. So who are they directing that request to, and how is it being considered?
So the request could either come to the administration or it come to the Board of Trustees. And the administration could review it and determine, if it's something finite, small, they could make a recommendation to the board. If it's something that has larger implications, then the administration could recommend and initiate the advisory committee to be formed.
So who are those currently who on staff is receiving those requests? If a neighbor, so the question we asked when you left
The
is,
3 that I'm familiar with would predate Greg, but they came to planning and demographics. Either directed there by the superintendent's office, by me, or I think we may have had one directed there by a board member, directing the constituent to planning and demographics. I was trying to remember, there are 2 in the southern part of the county. Do you have a record of that, Greg? Or Skip in here? If you look back so we can supply that to the board. It's been several years since we've had one. I want to say 4 or 5 years. Do you remember, Mr. Davey? Nope, predated that.
Okay,
We'll get it and send it to the board. We've had either 2 or 3 in the last 10 or 12 years.
I think part of that's because people aren't sure who to send it to. They understand how to get their own child's special permission to attend a school. They don't understand how to get their neighborhood aligned with the school that's closer to them rather than the one that we sent them to during integration. And so you're saying that if a neighborhood has a request to have their neighborhood reassigned to a different high school, for example,
Yes.
that they should direct that to planning and demographics.
Directed to the superintendent's office, and we'll direct it to planning and demographics.
Okay. And based on what Ms. Wells put here, there's not an action that she's proposing, but I didn't think I fully understood what the administration wants to do or would do without board action. So
At this point, the administration doesn't have a plan to move forward to redistrict, to reassign the entire district. What the district administration would recommend is that the board, as constituted with the seating of the new board members, review this, and we certainly, if that requires a recommendation from the administration, we can make a recommendation that that board review it. But they do so having followed some sort of, and I think maybe Ms. Bush referred to it as an intensive workshop on what is the current condition, what are the current circumstances, what are these islands, how did they come about, how did they come into being, what are our current capacities, just like, you all get that in that long-range facility plan. It says how many seats there are at every school in the district. What's our current capacity? If you were to make these moves, how would it affect? In other words, just as a sample of that, you take a certain area and look at it and say, well, if you move this over here, then you got to move this from there to somewhere else. So that the newly constituted board and those individual board members understand the complexity of it, then this body decide, is that something they want to undertake wholesale or in part? Because right now, the requests that we've received that I recall in the past 10 plus years, it would all have required us moving somebody else out of the school in order to move that neighborhood into the school. And the first thing that we tell anybody that wants to go somewhere else is, as I went down and met with a group, Ms. Goodwin Caldwell's area, said to them, hey, look, you can ask to go here. And we had several that did ask to go, and they were approved to go to a closer school, which gives immediate relief to those individual families when there's space available. It's not a wholesale solution for the entire area, though.
Okay, I didn't talk to Ms. Wells about this action before, but I don't see her asking for a wholesale redrawing of all the lines. I think what we were looking for was an understanding that there would be a process in place where we could start looking at some of these issues that are coming up rather than retroactively. And I'll tell you where it's a concern for me is that, we are talking about building a new elementary school in the city of Greenville to accommodate growth that has happened in the city of Greenville and to accommodate growth that is going to happen along Lawrence Road that we already know is proposed and going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And so it concerns me when the solution being suggested by board members is, well, we just move the schools somewhere outside the city so we don't have to deal with the city of Greenville. Well, if we're using growth and planning to decide where our schools should be, then moving a school somewhere else just so we don't have to deal with bureaucracy isn't going to make it easier for those families to have a school near them. And so I'm concerned that the message given out to constituents in that area was, we know that your schools are so crowded that we need to build a new school to accommodate that growth, but we don't actually want it to be near you because we don't want to deal with these issues, so we're going to put the schools somewhere else. And so I want to make sure that there's a process in place so that when people want to see a school that's more convenient for them, that the district can accommodate those requests. And when we don't have an advisory committee that handles those requests, and now we're told, send those requests to planning and demographics through the administration, but only if you're okay with the fact that somebody else is going to get kicked out of your school. I don't think we're giving the public a really clear understanding of what the process is to get their neighborhood changed from one school attendance area to another. And I don't think that it's clear here what the administration is going to do to help resolve that.
Well, let me make it more clear then. The administration is going to do what this board directs it to do regarding that. Otherwise, we're going to continue to move forward with what we're doing now. And I would hope that no one got the idea that you just shared with us about we're going to build a school where we want to build it no matter whether it's convenient to you or not. The population in that area that we're seeking to relieve, some of those students are being driven to Pelham Road Elementary School right now. The population center for the school located at the old J.L. Mann property, number one, the boundary has not yet been decided, but the predominant residential growth in that area is not immediately in and around J.L. Mann. It's across Lawrence Road in the Hollingsworth property and further out from there. Talking about moving outside the city of Greenville, if we needed to do that, that boundary lies literally just on the other side of the interstate. We're not talking about moving 10, 12, 15 miles away. But that all hinges on the requirement placed on us to install $8 million worth of traffic circles. anything to do with the property itself. So I don't know how anyone would have gotten a communication about where we're going to move your children when first there has been no established attendance area for the school. I don't understand how they could have gotten that misconception. I hate that's occurred with anyone.
I don't have any other questions.
Me. Without objection, we'll, I got Mr. Meek and Mrs. Doolin, so let's say 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you. I've been here a while. Excuse me, can't talk. And I know what Ms. Wells is talking about. We have looked at this for the last 30 years, one way or the other. I don't believe that this board would want to have a wholesale distribution of children from one area to another. We have dealt with the problems when they have occurred successfully. As Dr. Royster said, there's probably been 3 instances where the community has come forward and say, hey, we'd like to move wholesale. Mostly it is usually 1 or 2 children. Islands, I hate islands. I hate islands. That's all there is to it. There is a purpose, there was a purpose, and there still is a purpose of those children being moved. Some of the children that have benefited from moving from a school that is deep in poverty and going to a school that has opened their eyes to a difference than what they may see around other children who are in the same situation they may be. I think that if the future board that'll be here in a couple of weeks wants to look at this, then that's fine. I think they'll just have to be very careful when they get into trying to move or thinking about moving lots and lots of kids from one school to another. I think Dr. Royster has laid it out pretty well. Our schools are not set up where they can go from elementary to middle to high school in a path that you may like to go. Sometimes we've got to do some things that we don't want to do. So good luck to you all. And I'll be looking at the news. I may even listen to you. It depends. It'll be my choice. So I may, at the same time, I'll be able to turn it off if I don't want to listen to you. So good luck on this. I think, Mr. Chairman, really this is a topic that should be dealt with at future boards. There's no need of, y'all gonna have to rehash it again for us sitting here. There's no need to really, in my mind, to keep discussing it.
I would believe the consensus of people in the room right now agrees that it does need to move forward. To the superintendent's point, timing is not perfect. That it?
That's for me.
Ms. Doolin.
Thank you. So I've lived the situation where you drive past one elementary school to get to the one that you're zoned for. I drove past Augusta Circle to get to Blythe. I never really understood why, but that's just the way the road was cut. If we do have a workshop, I think it would be beneficial just so that everyone gets a refresher on the actual attendance zones for the schools that you represent, especially those that will be new. I would like to request that the transportation department be a part of that because I'd like to know the cost savings. If if a whole neighborhood is having to be bused 15 miles away every day, but they could go to a closer school, there's probably a financial benefit. And I wouldn't really want to force anyone to move, but if it's a huge cost savings and they were invited to move and given an option rather than being forced, I mean, maybe neighborhoods might be more willing to try a new school if it's more convenient and if it saves the county a fortune in gas and bus driver hours. So I would just really like to request that if we do have a workshop, I think the transportation department should be a part of it. And that's it. Thank you.
Ms. Wells?
So just there's been a lot of other things said that, didn't really have anything to do with why I brought the motion forward. So I just want to recenter again, and I'm bringing it forward because this is my last chance, right? I don't have anything. This is my only voice that I have left to say this. And it is important. In my 12 years, I know Weatherstone was probably the last one that I remember went through a formal process that wanted to be rezoned. And the answer was no. When we opened up Monarch, there was a specific community that wanted to stay at Oakview, and we said no. So whether we've said that we deal with it, yeah, we deal with it, but we deal with it by saying no. So, and we're saying that because, well, if we move you, then we got to move somebody else, which goes back to, I said, we should examine what analysis has been applied to attendance zones, growth trends, and the connection to need for facility expansions, and seek ways to optimize attendance zones to respond to that growth and combat overcrowding in portables, to limit bus ride time, to reduce travel time for parents who transport students, and to encourage logical community-centered attendance boundaries. We have stuff like this in our facilities plan. We have things like this in the comp plan. So all I'm saying is, instead of saying, I'd never use the word wholesale. So that was somebody else's word. Your word, Dr. Royster's word, that's not what I was saying at all. All I'm saying is when we're adding on 250 seats at a time to all the schools in an area, just take a minute, spend $50,000 or whatever it would cost to have a consultant look at the data, analyze it, and say, yeah, we could smooth these boundaries and we could move these children in the next 2 to 3 to 4 years. So, it's just really about thinking differently about how, or using a tool that we've identified in our facilities plan as a tool that we should have in our toolbox that we have ignored for the 12 years I've been on the board. So didn't mean to create a stir, really just wanted to create some understanding. There were board members who said they didn't know what our policy said or how it had been used because it hasn't been used in their tenure. I felt like it was important to get a little education there, and then just wanted to say, I think it's important from a facility standpoint. So thank you for the time. Similarly, I appreciate that there are other board members that see the need for this, and wish I'd brought it a month sooner, but that's just the way the cookie crumbles. So that's it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome, Ms. Wells. This concludes the administration portion of today's agenda, and I'll turn it back over to Mr. Meek.
Thank you, Mr. Sailors. The next item on our agenda is building and grounds. Ms. Doolin.
Thank you. Item 5.01, facilities project report. Dr. Royster, do you have any statements?
Thank you, Ms. Doolin. Just one opening comment, then Colonel Carlton answer any questions that you all might have. We have, as we mentioned to you earlier, we finally have set a meeting with SCDOT for this Wednesday, correct, Colonel? Wednesday.
Yes, sir.
Including all the parties that have anything to do with the traffic flow issue in and around the proposed elementary at J.L. Mann. We attempted to get that scheduled earlier, but DOT was dealing with the concerns around the hurricane and in the aftermath, and then getting all those people's schedule aligned so that we have everybody there that needs to be there from the city. The local transportation committee, used to be C Funds Committee, GPAC, whatever it is now.
GLDTC.
GOETC, and SCDOT, and hopefully we can come to some resolution that doesn't involve the construction at our expense of $8 million worth of traffic circles. So we hope to get that resolved, hopefully, on Wednesday, but we'll see. We'll keep you informed of the results of that meeting. And now any question that you all might have about the facilities project update, I don't know if there were any, I don't recall there being any particular projects added, were there, Colonel, this month?
No, sir. The latest one we added was the demolition projects, but I think we put that on last month.
They're all in process. Don't know if they've actually knocked anything down yet, but
They have not.
contracts are let and they're ready to proceed as soon as they have abated any hazardous materials that were determined to be
That's
present.
correct. Completion date on that is mid-January.
Mid-January. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. McCullough?
On the weight room completion,
Yes, ma'am.
why is it that we only have one weight room that's gonna be completed in 2023? Are we slowing that process? Cause it jumped from 2023 to 4 of them being done in 2024.
When the board approved this multi-phase project back in 2019, the projects were structured based on funding. And so that last one I don't remember the exact number. I could talk to Ms. Stack and get that information, but it was funded over a period of time to complete in 2024. And that's why we're not doing them all at the same time.
But you're only doing one in 2023, and then you have 4 slated for 2024. You're saying that it's the funding, we don't have the funding there, we didn't put it in place so that we could get these things completed earlier?
No, ma'am. What we show there projected for 1 in 23 and the rest in 24 is our schedule based on when the funds are going to become available, and we are going to be able to complete some of these sooner than we were actually projecting to begin with.
Looking at it kind of from a different view, when we first put those in the long-range facility plan, we had a more than 10-year time frame to pay for them, to fund them. And we were able to compress that time frame down to, Robin, about 5 years. But it still depends on cash flow each year from bond receipts. So while we have the money, we don't have it all in hand in any one year. So the projects were spread over several years. Then we ran into design issues with 2 or 3 of them because we ended up building for those schools a third PE area because they had already converted their third PE area into a weight room that met the standard of the weight rooms we were constructing. And so as not to destruct that and build new, we're building them a third PE space so that at the end of the project, there's equity. That would be true at, we're doing something different at Blue Ridge, we're doing something different at Greenville High and Malden High School. And Malden, we discovered another inequity there that we're remedying while we're doing this. Then we had some back and forth on on building location on the property. So there's not an issue with funding. The funding will be there when we need it to pay for those projects at this point. Now, we don't know if we may have some price increase. There's 4 left that aren't bid yet, Colonel?
There's 3 of them. No, you're correct, 4.
So there are
4
4 that aren't, there are 4 that are not bid yet. So when we get those bids in, construction costs are continuing to escalate, particularly due to the shortage of certain components, HVAC system components, and now some other building material shortages. So we don't yet know till we get those back in. It shouldn't be an amount that it should not cause any disruption to getting them completed. Did that answer your question?
A little bit, but, so the list that we have here, is this was in order of how they were supposed to be done?
Yes,
list-
we've
the
not
list that
changed,
we
we've
have
not
here?
changed the order. The ones that were put at the end are the ones that had the better weight room space already in their facility. For example, East Side, which is an outlier, unlike the others. We built a weight room over there in a Butler-type building during the BEST program to give them some equity that they didn't previously have. So they could go towards the end of the list because they already had a weight room that was equal or greater in size than the square footage we were building. But we are building them a new weight room adjacent to the old gym and old auditorium, which is the reason that East Side is a renovation, not a new construction under BEST, because it has those two pieces left from the old school.
So East Side, you broke ground on East Side already?
No, ma'am.
For the-
Jordan's already on
We've,
site.
we've got construction activities going on out there, but we haven't started building any building out there
What
yet.
about the other three above it? That are
You mean
on this
past
list
that?
above it? Berea, Carolina, and Greenville High.
Berea's
That's above it.
Berea's underway, if not already at substantial
Just give me an
completion.
update on those.
Berea's 67%. Which ones, ma'am?
Berea, Carolina High, and Greenville High are right above East Side. If you broke ground on East Side, what about those three above it? For that's slated for 2024.
At Greenville High, there's an issue with matching the brick on the Greenville High building. They already have their weight room though. They converted their third PE space to a weight room a number of years ago. So we're building them the third PE space so that when we get done, they'll have a weight room that meets our new standard, and they'll have the three spaces, a spectator gym, a mini gym, and a multi-purpose PE area like all the other schools. The problem over there is the unusual nature of the brick on the outside of Greenville High, that yellow brick, and we got to match that up so it doesn't, because the addition's going right on the front. If you face the front of Greenville High, the Slickmore gym over there, where the driveway comes in front of that gym, that new addition is coming right out from that gym, so it's got to match up to the existing yellow brick.
Okay, well, what about Carolina High School?
I'm not sure the status of Carolina. I'm more familiar with the others.
We've got Carolina shown at 8% right now, Greenville High at 5, East Side at 5, but a lot of that's preliminary design work. I can get the particulars on each of these and get back with you.
They are already
Ms. Goodwin
breaking
Caldwell.
ground. It's still at 5%?
No, a lot of that is
For
part of
East
our
Side?
design process.
Well,
Okay. And so they probably all will be done before 2024.
We are accelerating all these projects based on our current availability with the contractor.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you. I'm done.
Sorry, Ms. Mosley?
I just want a point of clarification. I sat in a PTA meeting the other day that said our weight room was going to be optimistically done around March of 2023. Is that right? I mean, assuming no delays and the
They were-
spring. I was told spring, but I think I heard March.
They were scheduled originally to be completed, the first 8, spring of '22, 1 in spring of '23, 5 in spring of '25. So we're ahead of schedule on the vast
I
majority.
think she's asking
I'm
specifically
asking
about East
specifically for
Side.
East Side High School. I understood from our principal that we were looking forward to having a new weight room completed by this coming spring, before the school year ends. Is that right? Okay. Okay.
We need to confirm the date that you were given and make
I
sure.
wasn't given an exact date. I was just given a ballpark area.
We need to make sure that
Okay.
everybody's on the same page with it.
Okay. I was just making sure what I heard was aligning with what, okay. Thank you.
Mr. Sailors.
Real quick, Scott, to Michelle's point, there's a difference between mobilization of the contractor. In this case, Jordan being on site at Eastside. And groundbreaking. So just because they mobilized, they've got the silt fences up and all their infrastructure ready to go, that doesn't mean that the work has started. Am I correct? Okay, thank you.
Okay, Ms. Wells.
Yes, just to help on the facilities plan projections, what are the number of seats that each one of those elementary school additions are adding? Is it 250? I said 250 earlier, but for all the elementary additions that we have planned.
In most cases, I believe it is.
Because they're 750 now, or okay, so Ellen Woodside, Fort Shoals, Simpsonville, Mountain View, Sioux Cleveland, those are all 250 student expansions, you think?
I believe in general that's correct. We'll confirm that. Mr. David, you have that list in front of you? We'll get them by location and send them to you this afternoon.
Is that going to make them all 1,000 students?
No, it makes Woodland 1,300.
Woodland's not on here.
Woodside?
Woodland.
Woodland's not on here, it's Ellen Woodside.
That's not one of your five. That is, Woodland is on the CIP.
Right, it's not on the facilities update list.
Yeah.
So that's
Oh,
what
I'm
I was
sorry.
asking about. That. So these 5 specific ones that are supposed to be done in the next 2 years, they're going from 750 to 1,000, all of them? Okay.
I believe that's correct. We'll confirm.
Okay, Greg was shaking his head. Okay, all right, thank you. You know, I did my thing at the board meeting. What I will say, because I didn't say this at the board meeting, this seemed like a more appropriate place is, and I'm gonna try not to get emotional this time. I am so appreciative of all the people in this room, I can't help it, that spent time talking with me and helping me understand and explain things. We learn a lot in the boardroom, but most of what we learn and what we figure out that's worth anything is what we learn from you guys outside the boardroom. So I know it's tricky, it's a balance, you know, but I am really appreciative of all the sidebar conversations that I have been able to have with folks in this room and a few that aren't around anymore to really help me be a great board member. I think I have been, but I think I would attribute all that to using my listening ears, which is always easy for me, but doing that and really trying to push forward the things that I have heard you guys say that are really important that have led to a vision that I could help carry forward. So I would just say, you know, thank you to all of you for doing a great job working with this board. Thank you.
Mr. Suddeth, you told me earlier you didn't have any words. Do you want to
Thank
say
you.
anything? Thank you. Okay, I've got a statement I want to read instead of ad-libbing it. I'll get mixed up. I'll forget something. And I don't want to do that. So, you know, I've received my 2-week notice a couple of weeks ago. So therefore, I want to go ahead and say what I've got to say. During this past week, I've had a great opportunity to reflect on the past 28 years of my service to my community. This past 28 years has been a time of tremendous growth for me personally and for this district I've grown to love. I've realized that it's not so much my love of this district as it is my love for the people in the district. The personnel in this district are the best in the world. The knowledge and passion for what the employees of this district bring to the table is unsurpassed. I am so lucky. I grew up in the Appalachian Mountains of eastern Kentucky in a coal mining community with very little hope of ever leaving. My heroes were my much older cousins that had grown up in the same community, but was able to find their way out and become teachers in Ohio and Florida. I grew up thinking if I could ever get a college degree and become a teacher and buy me a fancy Corvair like they drove, then I would be set for life. To make a very long story short, I was able to get out of those hills and got a college degree by using the GI Bill, but I never did become a teacher, nor did I get the Corvair. I tell you this story so you know if it had not been for my dream of an education, then I would have never met so many wonderful educators here in Greenville County. I have appreciated, excuse me, it's your follies. I have appreciated knowing each and every one of you, and I would like to personally thank you, but this will probably have to do until we meet again. A great friend of mine gave me some very great and encouraging words this past week. She said, God would not have let you lose the election unless he had something else. I'm not going to be able to do it. I just want to say thank you, and we'll leave it to that. Thank you. I was for sure I could get through it, but I can't. We have a meeting right after this, and with a motion, I want to adjourn, and then. You want to do that now? I'll let you do that if you want to. Okay.
Ms. Bush will do one.
Okay. I guess before we'll end, the superintendent said that Ms. Bush would like to go ahead and give our name tags to us. So Ms. Bush, if you'll do that, please.
Yes, actually, let's see. Well, since you're still chairman, why don't you do 3 and I'll do 1? The presentation of their name. That can take.
They're gonna keep me working.
That's where we were, right?
To the last minute.
Well, on behalf of the board, give me a big hug. Thank you for your service, and your name tag is yours. Keep for the board. Mr. Sutter, thank you a whole lot, sir. Thank you for your service. And this is yours.
How much it cost me?
Ask Dick McEwen, he could tell you. I can't tell you. So, thank you all very much.
You've been through 28 budgets. I don't have the total of dollars. 28 budgets, 5 superintendents?
Yes.
5 superintendents. And in my rough estimate, 30 different school board members, and in excess of 30 different board members that you've worked with. And and the small piece of wood, it just does not recognize all the things that you've done and all the things that you've accomplished and how much you've meant to this district. And even to the people that didn't vote for you, that you prepared a district for their children and their grandchildren, as well as, when we started this, we both had kids in school. And now for your grandchildren, that you set in place a system that will give them every opportunity to be the success that we know every child could be. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, I need a motion to adjourn.
Mr. Chairman, I move we adjourn the committee of the whole meeting.
Have a motion, a second, any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. The motion carries. Now I would like to, Chris, are you ready? We're gonna go in? Okay. At this point, I'd like to call the special call meeting to order. Ms. Bush, you have a motion?
Yes, I move that we go into executive session for, to discuss student discipline appeal, receipt of legal advice pertaining to student legal claims, and a continuation of superintendent's evaluation.
We heard the motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. The motion carries. We're in executive session. Thank you. We have been in executive session and discussing some items, and no decisions were made, no votes were taken. Does anybody have a motion?
Mr. Chairman.
I have a motion. I have a
Dr.
motion.
Stiles.
Yes, I would like to make the motion to affirm the decision of the hearing officer and deny the appeal.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, all in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. The motion carries. That concludes our special called meeting. I need a motion
Chairman,
to
I
adjourn.
move we adjourn.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. Motion carries. We are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.